British civil servant. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 76, The Last Day. Oh, Alexander, there is no need for such a welcoming ceremony. You know, I don't like it. With a well-deserved expression, Edward Bridges said in a calm tone, after getting off the military plane. For officials like us, what we can do is to defend the civilization of the British Empire. This is our job, Mr. Edward. In fact, these young and energetic reserve forces really want to learn from you. It's not that I have to do this, but these excellent children have to think that this is the only way to express their respect for you. Alexander Cadogan, the permanent undersecretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, patted his horse in front of Edward Bridges without leaving a trace, indicating that everything is the public opinion here, without any prejudice. Where is our respected Marshal Montgomery? Edward Bridges did not expect the other party to come to greet him, but just asked simply, Marshal Montgomery will be back soon, and Paris is not far away. Alexander Cadogan whispered. Montgomery went to Paris to host the opening ceremony of the British military exhibition, and the whole city of Paris came out to welcome him. General de Gaulle held a colorful military parade for Montgomery at the Invalides in Paris, and awarded him the first-class Medal of Honor. As for yesterday, he flew to Antwerp to celebrate the city's freedom. At the celebration ceremony, Montgomery was awarded the title of Honorary Citizen of Antwerp and the Golden Dagger of Antwerp. After the celebration ceremony, there was another sumptuous lunch. Edward Bridges nodded. This time he brought the Knight's Grand Cross of the Bath, and planned to let Marshal Montgomery award Marshals UCUV with a medal at the beginning of the joint military parade, which was equivalent to the previous Victory Medal. Well, I won't dwell on these details. The Marshal's welcome also shows the influence of the British Empire in Europe. Edward Bridges gave the other party a look of approval, walked in front of these diplomats, paused for a moment in front of Alan Wilson and said, "Oh, I have seen your file. Are you used to coming to Europe from British India? I hope your work experience in Asia will help you in your current work." "Dear Sir Edward, I have a lot to learn, and I gain new knowledge every day." Alan Wilson bowed his head slightly and showed respect to the current British Cabinet Secretary. It seems that Baron is still good at discovering talents. Edward Bridges nodded slightly, walked out of the crowd, left the runway, and soon arrived at the headquarters of the British Foreign Office in Berlin. Edward Bridges, who had just arrived in Berlin, did not have time to lecture the younger generation of the British Empire who respected him, but quickly contacted the British troops stationed in Berlin to inquire about the protection force of the Potsdam Conference. Edward Bridges, dressed in a suit, was not afraid of the stage in front of General Rhine, the commander of the British Army in Berlin, and talked and laughed happily, and also brought the latest situation in London. After communicating with the military, Edward Bridges replaced Alexander Cadogan, and said in an expectant tone, "Although the specific situation is not yet clear, I believe our smart backup forces can probably guess it. Yes, Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union, three major countries with decisive influence in the world today, are going to discuss some things that will determine the future of the world. At least Prime Minister Churchill thinks so." After a pause, Edward Bridges let out a long breath and said, "Now let me see how the backbone of the future British Empire is prepared. I believe Alexander has told you." As soon as the voice fell, the diplomats in the conference room took out a thick stack of documents and put them in front of them with a loud sound. Edward Bridges pushed his black-framed glasses, sighed in his heart, but said calmly on the surface, "Idiot version." Alan Wilson directly took out 2 pages of paper from the thick documents in his palm. Compared with the response method piled up with boring words, this is what the cabinet secretary needs. Out of respect for the negotiating opponent, it is foreseeable that this meeting will be long. The foreign secretary is a politician I respect very much, but we cannot let him be too tired. After all, the opponent is known for his cunning and fickleness. Edward Bridges flipped through the documents and suddenly asked, "Alan, the Oriental College majors in the Far East, India and Arabia, and even includes courses on Eastern European countries. You have no problem, and you may have constructive opinions on Eastern European affairs. Sir Edward, there is no doubt that our opponents and countries that are temporarily considered allies are not easy to deal with. We have to argue and compromise and try our best to protect the interests of the British Empire. Alan Wilson chose the Chinese major at the Oriental College because he considered the success rate at the beginning. After all, the original foundation is there, which can reduce many boring courses and make it easier to get results. Edward Bridges asked about Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, which was not difficult for him, as his homeland in his previous life was similar. Edward Bridges did not expect that his casual question would actually lead to a diplomat who seemed to have analyzed the Soviet Union in all aspects. He pondered for a moment and said, "Alan, after the meeting begins, you will accompany the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary. Don't be nervous at that time, and show your wit." In 1941, Edward Bridges had read Alan Wilson's files and naturally knew what happened before and after Pearl Harbor. He also knew that Alan Wilson was also an informant of MI6, but his activities were overseas. Alan Wilson, who was hit by a pie in the sky, was stunned for a moment and immediately suppressed his ecstasy and said that he would definitely contribute his life to the British Empire. Being able to directly participate in the talks could leave a strong mark in his resume, although he still prefers the free and easy environment of British India. At noon the next day, Marshal Montgomery completed the special performances in cities in various European countries and returned to Berlin. Unlike in history, according to the current news, General Patton will not come to this joint parade. The representative of the United States is General Eisenhower, who has agreed to come to Berlin, which can be said to be very considerate of the Soviet people's emotions. Although Berlin was still a ruin, the site for the military parade had been cleared, waiting for the show to begin. On the afternoon of June 23rd, in the huge refugee camp on the Austrian border, Mihajlović called the assistance of the Yugoslav Fatherland Army to come over and expressed his worries about the future. "Tito will not be kind to us. He is a Croatian. When talking about doctrine with his subordinates, the other party may not understand, but when Mihajlović mentioned the Croatians, these Mihajlovic's subordinates understood and said that they could not pin their hopes on Tito's kindness." Chapter 77 Women and Children in Front. Compared with Tito's troops, and like many old armies and new armies, Mihajlovic's biggest disadvantage is the difference in the degree of organization. Many local leaders and soldiers joined the armed forces of the Home Army voluntarily. Mihajlović did not have strong leadership power. Many local generals did not obey him very much, and many of these generals cooperated with the German army. This is also one of the reasons why the British concluded that the combat effectiveness of the Home Army was not as good as Tito after investigation, and finally turned to support Tito. However, in terms of numbers, there is no difference between the Yugoslav Home Army and Tito at the beginning. The same is true for the Yugoslav Home Army on the Austrian border. Because they were chased by Tito's troops and had no way to enter the ground, Mihajlovic's authority has increased instead, and he has a certain restraint on the entire Yugoslav Home Army, but it is still not an authority that can make the final decision. When the time comes, he can only persuade other commanders as much as possible. For so many days, Mihajlović has remained silent and withstood the huge psychological pressure. He has the psychological quality to lead the Motherland Army for many years. The counter effect of this is that the entire Yugoslav Motherland Army is now in a panic and full of fear for the future. Mihajlović actually knows this very well. The Croatians cannot be trusted. Although the Croatian Ustasha armed forces have also been chased to the Austrian border by Tito, this can prove that Tito is so cruel to his own people. There is no reason to let them, the Serbian-based Motherland Army, go. "Colonel, what do you think we should do?" The major commanders who came to Mihajlović felt that the situation was serious. Once they return to Yugoslavia and face Tito, these people are doomed to be miserable. It's not that there is no way, but we have no choice. Mihajlović took out the words he had prepared long ago and said in a sad tone, "We can't sit and wait for death. If we return to Yugoslavia, we will lose the ability to resist. Now there is only one person who can save us." Who? Everyone looked at each other. They knew that Mihajlović had disappeared for a few days, but no one knew where Mihajlović had gone. They thought that Mihajlović had found a route to exile. Later, Mihajlović reappeared, and no one thought much about it. They were kept in the dark about the whole thing, so they naturally didn't know what the so-called solution was. And the most important thing is that all the weapons in their hands have been confiscated by the British. Where can they go without weapons? Even if we have weapons, we can't beat the British and American troops. Now without weapons, we are pure refugees. With such a large number of refugees, no army can shoot without scruples. We let children and women go in front to open the way for us and bet on whether British and American soldiers will shoot. If Alan Wilson was here, he would definitely shout that he was an expert when he heard Mihajlovic say this. The refugees who poured into Europe in the future like to let women and children take the lead, arouse the sympathy of Europeans, break through the border, and then refuse to leave. Mihajlovic now lets women and children cover his troops in front. He has already mastered the essence of shamelessness. He is worthy of being the leader of the Motherland Army for many years. Hearing Mihajlovic's words, the commanders around him were obviously moved. In fact, even if Alan Wilson was here, he felt that it might succeed. In this era, there will be no compassionate groups in Europe. European countries have gone through years of war and are numb to various tragedies. How can there be extra sympathy? However, the US military group is not necessarily the same. First of all, the US mainland has not been affected by the war. In the big environment, the US military has not fought any hard battles, and now the United States is still trying to establish its image and gain a foothold in Europe. Shooting at a large number of unarmed refugees will cause a large number of deaths. Although various reasons can be used to shirk responsibility at that time, now European countries have various sickles and hammers. Once the US military shoots and causes a large number of deaths, the Soviet Union may directly forget that these people are Tito's opponents and say that they are refugees and let the US military be responsible, or take a step back. This is an organized and premeditated move by imperialist countries to subvert Yugoslavia. The propaganda machine was turned on to attack the image of the United States. The pro-Soviet parties in European countries catered to it, which might really embarrass the Americans. Even if none of the above assumptions occurred, there was one last factor. General Patton did not go to Berlin as in history. Eisenhower went to Berlin in person, and General Patton was in Bavaria. After all the internal and external factors were added together, and after arriving in Europe, it was discovered that Austria was nominally divided into 4 countries, but in fact it was equivalent to the Soviet Union's monopoly, and there were only 2 battalions of soldiers in the British occupied zone. Alan Wilson saw the loophole and inadvertently pointed out a clear way for Mihajlovic. That's it. Mihajlovic had made up his mind. According to my information, General Patton is extremely dissatisfied with the Soviet Union. His attitude is very important for us to run towards freedom this time. Maybe the Third World War will break out. At that time, we can follow the US military and fight back to Yugoslavia to take back everything we lost. At that time, we will solve the problem with the Croatians. But now, facing Tito, we are in a situation with the nearby Croatians. Don't waste time for the time being. Alan Wilson was here, and he might exclaim that Mihajlovic still had the potential of Changong. The temperament of blaming the sky, the earth, and the air, blaming the Soviet revisionists and the American empires, was so similar. Still expecting the Third World War? However, Mihajlovic's words were indeed a shot in the arm for the commanders of the Homeland Army who had lost their homes, and were like dogs without a home. In the camp of the Homeland Army group, the commanders of the Homeland Army who returned from Mihajlovic issued unclear orders to their subordinates. It seems clear, but it is unclear when you think about it carefully. In the peaceful camp, a slight ripple appeared on June 23rd. No one knew what kind of influence this ripple would have. Mihajlovic's eyes almost followed the sun. He hoped that the time for action would come soon, but he also hoped that it would never come. Mihajlovic, who was in a state of high tension, had bloodshot eyes but no fatigue. Whether he lived or died depended on the action at midnight. As darkness fell, it seemed that today was just another ordinary day. Nearing 12 o'clock, the camp of the Yugoslav Fatherland Army was full of restlessness, like a calm lake boiling. Men, women, old and young, who were called up by the soldiers of the Fatherland Army, looked at the lead torches and didn't understand what to do at midnight. Women and children, come out and follow us. A soldier shouted, pushing the women and children in front to take action. Chapter 78 Joint Military Parade. At midnight on June 23, the Austrian border, which had been silent for a long time, was boiling like a volcano. The soldiers of the Yugoslav Fatherland Army and their families rushed to the road of freedom in the dark. The future was uncertain, and they were worried. Amid the shouts of the men, women, and children got on carts, or walked north directly. The British didn't know about such a big movement, but the Croatians and Slovenes near the Serbian camp couldn't be unaware of it. Soon the news spread, and the Croatians and Slovenes heard the news and moved. Although they didn't know the specific situation, their instinct drove them to follow the actions of the Serbs. This has to mention the history of Yugoslavia. The modern history of Yugoslavia can be summarized as the history of Serbia's attempt to establish Greater Yugoslavia and annex other ethnic groups but failed. In Yugoslavia, the Serbian population only occupies a majority among the individual ethnic groups, but it is far from half. The name of the first Yugoslavia, when it was established, Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, explains the nature of this country. It is a country formed by the union of different Yugoslav ethnic groups. The Serbs are only the majority ethnic group, but the number of people in other regions is far greater than the Serbian population. Although the Serbs are not the main ethnic group, in the short history of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, the Serbs did occupy a dominant position, and have the ability to influence other ethnic groups. This ability is subtle. Whether it is the Croats or the Slovenes, although they are hostile to the Serbs, they subconsciously act according to the Serbs. At midnight on this day, this psychology was vividly manifested. The neighboring Croatians knew about the big movement in the Serbian camp. Although they did not know what the Serbs' purpose was, under Tito's high pressure, the Croatians and the home army, which was mainly composed of Serbs, were in an environment to keep each other warm. As for this mentality, seeing the Serbs heading north, the Croatians instinctively followed, and then the Slovenes, and the domino effect appeared. At midnight, the Austrian border was bustling, as noisy as a downtown, with torches and people interweaving and moving northward. If someone could open the God's perspective and pay attention to the details of this movement, they would be very surprised to find that it involved the movement of 200,000 people, and it perfectly avoided the camp where the occupation forces were located. Of course, this is also reasonable. After all, the current situation in Austria is special. The British Army has only 2 battalions in the British occupied area of Austria, and the American and French occupation areas are similar. Austria is actually under the control of the Soviet Army, but for the overall situation, the Soviet Red Army is in the Soviet occupied area, giving courtesy to the United States, Britain and France. This loophole that even the parties involved would not notice has become a fatal negligence at this time, and has become a footnote to this escape that shocked the world. The fugitives moving north are full of strength, and the way to survive is ahead. All fatigue and anxiety disappear. Going north, north, and north again is their only goal now. At this time, there were no Serbs, no Croats, and no Slovenes. They were all the same kind of people. People who avoided being repatriated and waiting for Tito's liquidation. Under the night, a long march of people composed of torches awakened Austria from its calm, but for Europe, which had been through years of war, this little noise was actually nothing. Hundreds of kilometers away, Berlin was holding a victory celebration. Unlike history, this victory parade was 3 months earlier. The comradeship of the joint victory over Germany was still there, and the expected Potsdam Conference would be held in a few days. The United States, the Soviet Union, Britain and France were all trying their best to create an atmosphere of unity. Everyone knew that the war was not over yet. Japan was still struggling to survive, and the British and American troops on the Pacific Front were still fighting the Japanese army. It was very important to persuade the Soviet Union to join the war against Japan at this time. Before the meeting started, in fact, everything could only be regarded as unknown. As far as Alan Wilson knew, there were some signs of desperate attempts on the eve of Japan's defeat, and even placed hope on the Soviet Union. Counting on the Soviet Union to mediate, the United States, which was pressing forward step by step, withdrew from the war conditionally. This is not incomprehensible. In fact, just like the Germans hoped to surrender to the Western Front, the Germans knew very well what immoral things they had done on the Eastern Front, so they avoided falling into the hands of the Soviets. The Japanese mentality was exactly the opposite. When choosing between the Soviet Union and the Americans, it was normal for the Japanese to pin their hopes on the Soviet Union to avoid being dealt with by the Americans. At 8 o'clock in the morning, at the Berlin Parade Ground, the soldiers of the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain and France who participated in the parade were ready. At the same time, the Soviet Union's victory parade on Red Square in Moscow followed the same steps. Marshal Rokossovsky served as the commander-in-chief of the Red Square Parade, while Marshal Zhukov served as the commander-in-chief of the Berlin Joint Parade. Rokossovsky appeared on Red Square with the sound of the bells from the Kremlin clock tower. After the command standard attention, the parade begins. The chime clock rang 10 times, and the military band played Glinka's famous song Glory to the Russian People. Marshal Rokossovsky rode a white warhorse through the Spassky Gate and entered Red Square. Marshal Rokossovsky, the commander-in-chief of the parade, reported to Stalin, "Comrade Stalin, the active troops, naval troops and Moscow garrison troops participating in the parade have been formed. Please review them. Ura." Alan Wilson naturally couldn't hear Moscow's cheers, but at the joint military parade in Berlin, Soviet soldiers shouted Ura to Marshal Zhukov, which also attracted the attention of participants from other countries. Even Marshals Eisenhower and Montgomery were very impressed by the mental state of the Soviet soldiers on parade. What I saw were the brave faces of the soldiers who had been tempered by the flames of war and their eyes that showed joy. The newly made uniforms worn by the soldiers, with medals and awards shining on them. Marshal Zhukov gave a speech to the soldiers on parade. People all over the world who cherish peace are grateful for the contributions made by the brave soldiers in their hearts. This gratitude includes the Soviet Union, as well as the great allies of the United States, Britain, France and other allies. Today, on this grand day of celebration, we would like to express our great and lofty respect to them. Glory belongs to all the heroes who sacrificed for this war. Ura. After Zhukov's speech, the Soviet soldiers at the joint parade shouted again. General Eisenhower looked at Marshal Montgomery with an inexplicable look. He felt that he should talk to the British. "I have something to do today, so the update is late." Chapter 79 Emergency. The 4 countries' troops on parade, the 248th Red Banner Infantry Division, the 2nd French Infantry Division, the 131st British Infantry Brigade and the 82nd US Airborne Division, began the Grand Parade from the Reichstag to the Brandenburg Gate under the gaze of more than 20,000 Berlin citizens. The order of the Infantry Square Parade began with Soviet soldiers. On the rostrum, Marshal Zhukov of the Soviet Union, Marshal Montgomery of the United Kingdom, General Eisenhower of the United States and General de Latter de Tassigny of France, high-level commanders representing the Allied forces stood side by side. Accompanied by majestic military music, Soviet soldiers walked goose steps and passed by the rostrum one by one. On the wall not far away were giant portraits of the 3 giants of the Allied powers, Churchill, Truman and Stalin. Reporters from various countries held cameras and took pictures of the queue. Although Alan Wilson did not have a camera in his hand, his eyes did not leave the parade. Whether to admit it or not, compared with socialist countries, Britain, the United States and France are indeed a little bit behind in the matter of military parades. If there was no military parade of the Soviet Red Army soldiers, the little commissioner would not even bother to come, and it would be better to watch the mass parade. Sure enough, after the Soviet soldiers walked across the rostrum with great dignity, the French phalanx that was reviewed appeared and looked much inferior. The French parade phalanx doesn't seem to be very serious. The pioneer of insulting France, F4, muttered in a low voice, "We are allies." Alan Wilson reminded softly, "But who maliciously arranged the order of France after the Soviet Union?" This comparison does make the French soldiers look not so good. Of course, this is only the one-sided understanding of the 2 diplomats. Any national phalanx that appeared has killed a lot of film, and there is no lack of cheers. We cannot be prejudiced just because it is the French phalanx. After the marching phalanx, the heavy weapons phalanx started from the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union came out as the last. The British troops attending the parade came from the 7th Armored Division of Marshal Montgomery. This is the British Ace unit that has been famous since the North African campaign. As soon as it appeared, it was greeted with cheers from all the British present. The finale weapon of the 7th Armoured Division was the Comet cruiser tank. In the North African battlefield, the British tanks did not have artillery that could destroy German tanks. This is one of the reasons why the British Army suffered a series of defeats. For this reason, the British Ministry of Defence decided to develop a cruiser tank with more powerful firepower, based on the Cromwell cruiser tank. This is the origin of the Comet tank. The main gun of the Comet cruiser tank is a 17-pounder gun, which is known as the strongest tank gun of the Allied forces on the Western Front. Although Alan Wilson, the Hyderabad commissioner, has been trying to sell this tank to the Indians, since it is his own child, it is naturally full of advantages. Alan Wilson also joined in the cheering. Of course, he has reason to cheer. The Sherman tanks of the US military are not better than the Comet cruiser tanks at all. Some indicators are not as good as the Comet tanks. Compared with the Soviet and German beasts, the British Army in 1945 is not inferior to the US Army. If they can't be better, can they be worse? This is a world of comparison. As the heavy weapons columns of France and the United States were reviewed, the heavy tank regiment of the Soviet 2nd Guards Tank Army, the finale of the heavy weapons column, appeared. What is that? General Eisenhower stared at the Soviet tanks that appeared. This was a Soviet tank that had never been seen before and was not mastered by the US military. However, from the terrifying appearance, it can be seen that this Soviet tank is no match for the tanks currently in service in Britain and the United States. The huge main gun seems to have the power to destroy everything. Compared with Marshal Montgomery, who was simply curious about the performance of the weapon, General Eisenhower obviously paid more attention to the deeper issues. Was this the Soviet Union's display of military power through this military parade to deter the United States, Britain and France? The generals and officers of various countries present were discussing it. This was a new type of tank that they had never seen before. Its round turret and unique body shape left a deep impression on the generals of the Allied countries. The 2 rows of his 3 heavy tanks slowly passed in front of the rostrum, causing a lot of discussion. Marshals Zhukov looked very confident, which formed a sharp contrast with the officers of other countries. Eisenhower also noticed this. Just as he was about to speak to keep quiet so as not to be laughed at by the Soviets, a staff officer quickly came to Eisenhower's side and whispered something at a very fast speed. What? General Eisenhower lost his voice. Obviously, this matter made him lose his composure more than the Soviet heavy tanks just now. Eisenhower's loss of composure caused a lot of sidelong glances because the Soviet tanks had just passed by, and many people thought that this was a new Soviet weapon, which frightened the commander-in-chief of the US military. Eisenhower did not have time to think about these things. The news that just came was more important than the Soviet tanks in front of him. He directly whispered to the staff officer, "Now they have poured into Austria, why don't you stop them? The only force that can defend the border in Austria is the Soviet army. We have no army in our occupied area." The staff officer smiled bitterly and said, "The troops of the United States, Britain and France have not officially entered Austria yet. They only have nominal forces. We were supposed to discuss this matter in the upcoming meeting." Eisenhower's head was buzzing. It was indeed an oversight, but it led to such serious consequences. The problem was that he couldn't solve this problem at all. This was not something he or Marshal Zhukov could decide. Only the current leaders of the countries could decide when they could enter Austria and carry out the 4-nation occupation. General Eisenhower, the Marshal asked me to ask if you feel uncomfortable. Before General Eisenhower could come up with a solution, a Soviet officer came over and greeted him in fluent English. The huge refugee team, after marching all night, had approached the border between Germany and Austria. Stimulated by the desire to survive, these refugees who were approaching the German border step by step were not only not tired, but also full of energy. Women and children were in front, and adult men were behind, full of the desire to survive, maintaining the marching speed throughout the night. General Eisenhower, who was still at the Berlin military parade, finally insisted on finishing the parade. He immediately asked his staff to contact the American agency in Austria to find out what the current status of this group of refugees was and where their destination was. At the same time, he informed the British representatives of the movement in the border area. In fact, Alan Wilson also learned the news after the parade. After all, he was the liaison officer who was specifically responsible for handling this matter. Although he knew it well, Alan Wilson also understood that he must not be clever in this matter, and concealing it would not work. He quickly went to the residence of Cabinet Secretary Edward Bridges to report. Chapter 80 Real Man Pattern. "Oh, young Alan, what's the matter?" Edward Bridges was a little surprised that Alan Wilson suddenly appeared in front of him. He had not encountered such a thing for a long time. "Is it about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs?" "Relax, you know, when it comes to diplomatic affairs, your job is limited to public relations, reception and hospitality. There is nothing difficult in it. Maybe Baron has not taught you these yet." Edward Bridges showed an attitude that everything was under control. He spoke calmly and did not behave impolitely towards Alan Wilson and lose his gentlemanly manners. "Sir Edward, something happened?" Alan Wilson organized his words with an anxious look. "Something happened that none of us wanted to happen, but it happened. Subjectively, we should try our best to stop it, but in fact we are helpless. We should express our attitude, but it is best to pretend not to know. We should play the role of the British Empire, but it is best to let it go. This is very embarrassing. Wow, I said Baron is good at discovering talents." Pointing to the chair in front of him and motioning Alan Wilson to sit down, Edward Bridges, holding afternoon tea in his hand, asked calmly, "What happened?" Alan Wilson immediately reported on the Yugoslav refugees crossing the border to the north, waiting for Edward Bridges' instructions. Edward Bridges held the afternoon tea in his hand motionlessly, glanced at Alan Wilson, and said inconspicuously, "This is a big deal, especially at a time like this, when the Potsdam Conference is about to be held. Elections will be held in the country soon. If the Potsdam Conference cannot be held because of this, the great Prime Minister may be very unhappy. Yes, Sir Edward, we don't want any trouble at this time." Alan Wilson's panic was not entirely fake. Deep down he was also afraid that the truth would be revealed. Although the probability was small, nothing was 100% certain, and one had to bear the consequences of doing something. It's rare that you can see the seriousness of the matter. "I remember you once went to Vienna specifically?" Seeing Alan Wilson's face change, Edward Bridges stretched out his hand to signal him to calm down. "We must avoid being anxious at all times and speaking with emotional agitation. That's what politicians do. As a successful civil servant, we must always remain calm and composed, but it doesn't mean that your matter is not serious." Edward Bridges paused and continued, "Strictly speaking, the crossing of these refugees is an emergency. We don't want to see consequences that may lead to the cancellation of the Potsdam Conference at such an important moment. If such consequences occur, and the Soviets find out the problem, even if this matter has nothing to do with you, you, as the person involved, may inevitably be affected. Then now it is a matter of dereliction of duty. Sir Edward, I'm very wronged." Alan Wilson made an excuse without thinking. "It's just a hypothesis, without any prejudice." Edward Bridges stretched out his finger and shook it indifferently, "So the current consequences depend on whether it affects the convening of the Potsdam Conference, and where these refugees are going. If they happen not to affect the order in the British occupied area, you are safe." At the dawn of peace, such an incident that could damage the unity of the Allies appeared. Alan Wilson certainly did not dare to guarantee that he would get out of this unscathed. In fact, even an ordinary cabinet secretary would be overwhelmed by this incident. But Edward Bridges was an exception. He was a cabinet secretary who had experienced the entire war period. From Prime Minister Chamberlain's response mistakes to Prime Minister Churchill's bullfighter-like bloody fight with Germany, all kinds of operations during the war, including major mistakes, were seen by him. Although this time, the Yugoslav refugee crossing the border incident was not a trivial matter, it was not very big. And now we have not seen the consequences. Since the consequences have not appeared, it is too early to deal with Alan Wilson. After Alan Wilson left, Edward Bridges closed his eyes and muttered to himself, "Baron, you can really cause problems for me." The Baron in Edward Bridges' mouth was naturally Sir Baron, the head of the civil service in British India. In terms of the important position of British India to the British Empire, as a cabinet secretary, he must have reliable subordinates in British India. Sir Baron, of course, often brought some local specialties from British India for Edward Bridges. However, the refugee wave from Yugoslavia was not as eye-catching as the US Commander-in-Chief Eisenhower being frightened by the new Soviet tanks. The Daily Mail and the Times reported the new heavy tanks that appeared in the joint military parade with sensational headlines. Some public opinion is actually very keen that the United States and the Soviet Union are currently in a fierce confrontation. The Yugoslav refugees, like fellow army ants, quickly crossed the small Austria and appeared on the border between Germany and Austria. By the evening, the news of the Yugoslav refugees crossing the border had spread completely. The top leaders of the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain and France were all aware of it, and General Eisenhower finally learned the destination of these refugees, Bavaria, Germany, where General Patton was located. Let them come. General Patton gave the order aggressively. He didn't know about the new Soviet tanks that appeared in the Berlin military parade during the day. I don't know why. Maybe Eisenhower wanted to determine the movement of these refugees, whether they stayed in Austria or something else. If they stayed in Austria, it was the British's problem, because the American occupation zone was north of the British occupation zone. Eisenhower did not contact Bavaria's chief executive Patton immediately, because he wanted to make up for his gaffe during the day and repair his image. He also thought that the British occupation zone would deal with these refugees directly, and he was making a fuss. With this idea, General Eisenhower knew that these people were just refugees without weapons, including women and children, and thought that the British in the British occupation zone could easily deal with this problem. This is the disadvantage of the joint forces, so the joint forces often suffer disastrous consequences because of the friendly forces being surrounded and immovable. The most important thing is that Eisenhower never dreamed that General Patton would actually order the shelter of these refugees. When he knew it, it was too late to send a telegram to stop it. On the southern border of Germany, countless refugees crossed the border with bare hands. The American soldiers who had learned of the situation looked at each other, and no one knew whether to shoot at these teams full of women and children. General Patton's order freed the soldiers who were in a dilemma and cleared the way for the refugees to enter Germany. Recommend a new book to a friend. My Age of Innocence 1999. Where do I come from? Where am I going? Who am I? 3 philosophical questions that can drive people crazy. Trouble. The reborn Lee Heo. Reborn in 1998, Lee Heo decided not to waste his years. Family, friendship, and love. I'm reborn. This era belongs to me. Chapter 81. Whose problem is this? General Patton's idea was very simple. Now the United States had a huge advantage and did not need to talk to the Soviets. With this advantage, they should make a concerted effort and unite Britain and France to continue to move eastward to eliminate the Soviet Union. In this way, the world would fall into the hands of the United States and its allies, or more precisely, into the hands of the United States. In this way, the United States would realize its long-cherished manifest destiny and fulfill the prediction of the American century. However, now there are all signs that the United States seems to be satisfied with the current progress and wants to coexist peacefully with the Soviet Union. This is something General Patton could not understand. Now that the armies of various countries are here, the United States has a great advantage. If the Soviet Union is not resolved now, there will be more trouble in the future. With such an opportunity, General Patton did not need to consider it at all. He directly ordered his troops to make way and let these Yugoslav Tito opponents enter Bavaria. A storm in the eyes of others was directly accepted by General Patton, who hoped that the war would break out again. From the night of June 24th to the day of June 25th, the radio waves that shuttled back and forth over Europe showed that Europe at this time was not as calm as it seemed on the surface. As General Patton took in this group of more than 200,000 people, there were several basic reactions from all parties. In the city of Greater Berlin, under the morning sun, Cabinet Secretary Edward Bridges was walking back and forth in the garden in front of his residence. Alexander Cadogan, Secretary of the Foreign Office, had just entered the garden and mentioned the latest developments regarding refugees crossing the border. Oh, haha. Edward Bridges' indifferent face flashed a hint of gloating, but immediately turned serious and said from a third-party bystander's perspective, the American cowboy is so brave, which means that this is currently an American problem and has nothing to do with our British Empire. We are just trying to dissuade the refugees with good intentions, but ultimately failed. I dare not say how much credit we have, but we are definitely not at fault. Of course there is no fault. Everyone knows that there are only 2 battalions in Austria, but on the contrary there are 100,000 Soviet Red Army soldiers. Only the Soviets can stop this, and we don't have this ability. Therefore, the problem of refugees crossing the border is that the Soviets were negligent in prevention, and the Americans eventually accepted them. It has nothing to do with us in the UK from beginning to end. Alexander Cadogan righteously distanced himself from the relationship, that's the fact. Don't rush to put the blame on the Soviets. Since this is a problem between the Soviets and the Americans, let's see how they resolve it. If necessary, we can act as a bridge in the middle. Edward Bridges stood still and pondered for a moment and asked, what are you going to say in the report telegram to the country? This is an isolated incident that happened by chance. On the eve of the upcoming summit, it is an excellent opportunity for our diplomats to test their abilities. Alexander Cadogan showed the professionalism of a secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Edward Bridges nodded with satisfaction and said, just reply like this. From the perspective of the parties involved, we have the most capital to sit still. Whether it is the Americans or the Soviets who come to protest or seek support first, what we have to do first is to wait patiently until General Patton finally ordered to take them in. The core of the discussion among the countries that learned of the situation was who was responsible. There is no doubt that Yugoslavia, as the country directly responsible, must be the most direct victim. More than 200,000 opposition members who were soldiers before fled abroad and found a place to be taken in. Tito had enough reasons to denounce. However, the voice of Yugoslavia can be ignored. At least Edward Bridges does not think that Yugoslavia's response is important. In fact, London has already begun to take in some forces of the Yugoslav Fatherland Army, but the scale is not so large. Now that they have gone to the Americans, that's better. It also saves the British Empire from the trouble that will arise later. In Edward Bridges' eyes, this is an American problem and has nothing to do with the British Empire. As for how the Americans will deal with this matter, we will have to wait and see. Whose problem is this? Now this issue is also the focus of debate in the Kremlin. After Beria reported the matter, he said angrily, there is no doubt that this is a conspiracy of imperialism. Is that so, Comrade Molotov? Stalin smiled after hearing Beria's words. His eyes fell on Molotov and said, what is certain at present is that Comrade Tito must be in a very bad mood now. I think so too, Comrade Stalin. Molotov said with a smile, Yugoslavia now must urgently need the support of the Soviet Union to denounce imperialism. In fact, from our perspective, this is a good thing. Stalin nodded with satisfaction. He was very satisfied with the answer and made his own decision. This is undoubtedly imperialism's interference in Yugoslavia's internal affairs. Morally, the Soviet Union will definitely stand on the side of Yugoslavia and denounce this hostility. However, for the overall situation, that the World War has not yet ended, I will negotiate with Churchill and Truman at the Potsdam Conference. The meaning is very clear. Stalin will not disrupt the Potsdam Conference that has been decided because of the refugee crossing issue this time. On the contrary, he will do justice for Yugoslavia at the Potsdam Conference. Molotov knew that Stalin was actually happy to see the embarrassment of the unruly Tito and even cheered for this sudden incident in his heart, but he would not say it on the surface. If a large number of oppositionists appeared in the Soviet Union and fled to the American territory, then this time Stalin would definitely use this Potsdam Conference to put pressure on the United States to bring the oppositionists over. But this is a matter of Yugoslavia. Stalin's condemnation at the Potsdam Conference was only moral. To be honest, he hoped that these oppositionists would not come back. As long as these oppositionists existed for one day, Tito would not dare to be too disrespectful to the Soviet Union. Molotov, who left the Kremlin, prepared two statements. He welcomed the upcoming Potsdam Conference, and the statement sent to Belgrade stood on Tito's point of view, believing that this was a subversion of the new Yugoslavia. What imperialist hostility, what class feelings. Anyway, it's free to write. Later, Alexander Cadogan took the Soviet statement and came to Edward Bridges again for advice. Like I said, this is now an American problem, and the Soviets retain the right to condemn. Edward Bridges was completely relieved. Sometimes it is indeed necessary to let the bullets fly for a while. Recommend a 100,000 word historical text. The title of the book is Emperors Chatting in Groups. What would it be like when the palaces and barracks of the emperors in history were equipped with Wi-Fi signal towers and connected to wires, and everyone had a high-end smartphone in their hands to chat and eat melons in a group chat? Qin Shi Huang, I will pass the throne to my descendants for thousands of years. Liu Bang, sorry, brother, I'm the final winner. Wang Mang, ahem. Liuxiu, Wang Mang, you bastard. Ko Pai, Gao Zhu, Emperor Guanwu, I'm sorry, I have usurped the throne for your descendants. Ko, rebellious son. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 82 Dismissal Order. I also learned patience from this incident. He flattered him habitually and then said, as if he remembered something, it seems that Alan is really lucky and can be exempted from punishment. From the work he has done since he returned to London, he is indeed overly busy. It's good to be young and have endless energy. Edward Bridges smiled and said with some envy, it's only been a short time and he has almost run through the allied areas. Of course, the more things he does, the greater the possibility of mistakes. The more he does, the more mistakes he makes. This situation also exists in London. Edward Bridges has been in the civil service system for many years, so he naturally knows it clearly. Young people always have some ideals, as long as these ideals are not dangerous. Alexander Cadogan said on the side. Ideals? Of course they are important. Edward Bridges almost slipped up and told the truth, but immediately continued. Alan was taken abroad by old Wilson very early, and it is possible that he was exposed to some inappropriate ideas. But from the current point of view, it is very gratifying that the experience of British India is not in vain. Colonial civil servants are an important part of the British Empire's civil service system. Who makes the British Empire a colonial empire? Not to mention others. Alexander Cadogan, the permanent secretary of the Foreign Office next to him, is a representative of colonial civil servants. Among the colonial civil servants, the civil servants of British India are the largest group. The 100,000 civil servants and their families in British India are not even less important than the local civil servants, and the number is close to half of the local civil servants. If the civil servant group in British India was not important, Sir Baron would not be particularly valued by Edward Bridges. This is not because he has a special preference for Sir Baron, but anyone who becomes a cabinet secretary will make the same choice. As for Alan Wilson's mistakes, Edward Bridges, judging from recent reports, was nothing more than being too energetic and eager to make progress when he first arrived in Europe, which led to some negligence. This is all forgivable. It is not a deliberate act, but it is not impossible that there is some secret operation with the Hyderabad monarch Ali Khan, because judging from the ship of food that arrived in Hamburg, Alan Wilson should be helping Ali Khan do something somewhere. This discussion determined that Alan Wilson was not affected by the refugee crossing this time. The cabinet secretary and the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have decided that this is an unpredictable isolated incident. No one wants such a thing to happen, but if it happens, they can only face it calmly. The British Empire has no responsibility in this matter. This is a problem for the United States, and the Soviet Union can reserve the right to pursue it. But the British Empire is willing to work hard for this, so that the United Allies will not blame each other for this. As for Alan Wilson's handling decision, it is for him to continue to maintain contact with the United States and assist in subsequent handling. This is not good. Alan Wilson felt a little embarrassed after being pointed out by Alexander Cadogan. What is the difference between this and letting the wolf watch the sheep? In fact, he knew the consequences of refugees crossing the border, and his heart was as clear as a mirror. It was precisely because he understood the consequences of this matter that he wanted to do this. On the one hand, it was to arouse the hostility of the Soviet Union, but it seemed to have no effect. The Soviet Union had already sent news that it would protest at the Potsdam Conference. On the other hand, it would be the problem of Yugoslavia, with such a group of powerful opponents abroad. Whether Tito was willing or not, he had to move closer to the Soviet Union. There was only one reason for doing this. The current Soviet Union was still too weak, and in the original European Cold War confrontation, the Soviet camp was indeed surrounded by the American camp. Even if Yugoslavia joined the Warsaw Pact, it would only level the geographical disadvantage. This would give the Soviet Union a channel to enter the Mediterranean, which was not strictly speaking leveled. After all, Yugoslavia, facing Italy influenced by the United States, was as embarrassed as the Soviet Union being strangled by the Baltic Sea. The Soviet Union did not show great hostility, but only said that it would propose negotiations at the Potsdam Conference. Although this would be an excuse for the Soviet Union to make trouble at the conference, the fact that the conference was held as scheduled still made London relieved. July 5th is the British general election. If the Potsdam Conference cannot be held as scheduled, it may have a significant impact on this election. However, Alan Wilson, who knows history, estimates that the Potsdam Conference cannot save Churchill. This election in history is not a close election at all. It can be said that the Conservative Party lost everything and was beaten by the Labour Party all the way. Even if the Potsdam Conference was held earlier than in history, the Conservative Party could not be saved. Alan Wilson, who was not affected, was writing a report to London, and naturally repeated the statement about the Cabinet Secretary and the Permanent Secretary of the Foreign Office, that this was an isolated incident. Then he mentioned the preparations for the Potsdam Conference and the attitude of the Soviet Union to ensure that the meeting could proceed as scheduled. For this reason, Alexander Cadogan, the Secretary of the Foreign Office, has already communicated with the Soviet side. In this incident of Yugoslav refugees crossing the border, the Soviet side maintained amazing restraint. Britain certainly welcomed this. In addition to Tito in Yugoslavia, another country that was uncomfortable was the United States. In Washington, the capital of the United States, Truman, the new owner of the White House, who succeeded Roosevelt as president after his death, was frowning at the telegram sent by Eisenhower. In the eyes of his new president, Patton was not stingy with the problem general. At the important moment, when the Potsdam Conference was about to be held, such a problem was created among the countries. General Patton showed undisguised hostility towards the Soviet Union, and many former German soldiers gathered around him. Looking at General Eisenhower's narration in the telegram, Truman fell into deep thought. The biggest problem now is to let the Soviets join the war against Japan and completely defeat the last country of resistance of the Axis powers. Truman will not give a good face to anyone who destroys this premise, and this is his first time to go abroad to attend an important international conference, and it was almost ruined. This is absolutely intolerable. Truman made an important decision to dismiss General Patton. The telegram quickly spread to Europe and reached Eisenhower. Patton would definitely not be the last one to experience the ruthlessness shown by Truman. Truman, who defeated Dewey a few years later, would also make Chiang Kai-shek experience it. Chapter 83 Cabinet Secretary's Concerns. General Eisenhower, who received the telegram from President Truman, was relieved. He finally had the opportunity to deal with this unruly and thorny subordinate. Because of General Pershing, if it was normal, Eisenhower really had no way to deal with this subordinate with a lower rank than himself. From this point of view, General Eisenhower even felt that the refugees crossing the border were not a completely bad thing, as long as he was not involved in the subsequent events. Therefore, Eisenhower agreed with the British definition of this incident as a purely coincidental isolated incident, and he had already determined in his heart that this was the truth of the whole thing, and there was no need to investigate the matter. Dismissing General Patton was the best result, and everyone was very happy. It must be said that the politician side of General Eisenhower played a leading role, and he understood President Truman's ideas very well. Before Truman arrived in Europe, General Eisenhower announced a new appointment, dismissing General Patton from his post as the governor of Bavaria on the grounds that General Patton was not good at domestic affairs. The position of commander of the Third Army of the United States was retained, but it was only a temporary retention. When the right opportunity came, Eisenhower would find a way to get Patton to a retirement position so that he would not have the opportunity to cause trouble in front of him. As of the time when General Patton was dismissed from the post of Chief Executive of Bavaria, this incident caused by refugees crossing the border, the blame-shifting contest that all parties competed to participate in, finally had someone to take the blame. In terms of qualifications and reputation, General Patton was the undisputed candidate who met General Eisenhower, a direct superior with strong politician attributes, and a new president who urgently needed to show up at an important international conference to get rid of the influence of President Roosevelt. The new president's ruthless face, coupled with the action of his immediate superior to clear the suspicion, led to General Patton becoming the person to take the blame. And General Patton was also the most suitable person, and ordinary people could not bear this black pot. Even if Alan Wilson was willing to take the initiative to stand up and admit his dereliction of duty, the Soviets would only think that this was a lack of sincerity of Britain and the United States, and they came up with a temporary worker to perfunctory the Soviet Union. So sometimes it is not a bad thing to have a low status. Before the great Prime Minister and the respected Foreign Minister arrived in Berlin, the diplomats were still making final preparations to allow the British Empire to fight for its own interests in this negotiation. Cabinet Secretary Edward Bridges was listening in and asked Foreign Secretary Alexander Cadogan to preside over the meeting while he gave guidance on the side. Similar meetings in the past history are not without reference. At the end of World War I, the Paris Peace Conference of the United States, Britain and France was similar to the Potsdam Conference that is about to be held. Listening to Alexander Cadogan and many diplomats discussing the upcoming meeting, Edward Bridges slowly said, "To find the correct position of the British Empire, we can judge the attitudes of the United States and the Soviet Union from the attitudes of the other two parties at the Paris Peace Conference. So who is in a similar situation to France now?" Alexander Cadogan turned his head and looked at the waiting diplomats. After years of fighting on their home soil, the Soviet Union suffered severe damage. The situation is similar to that of France. Alan Wilson answered this question and paused. "We can infer the attitude of the Soviet Union from the attitude of the French at the Paris Peace Conference." The Paris office said that the Paris newspapers have not reported the news of the Potsdam Conference in the past few days. Aforementioned the news, a few newspapers reported it, and it seems not friendly. The French. It's not surprising. There is no role for the French in this conference. They may feel uncomfortable. Alexander Cadogan took back the topic. It can be said that the Soviet Union's attitude towards Germany is similar to that of France after World War I, and our attitude is that we cannot let the tragedy of Germany's comeback after World War I happen again. After speaking, Alexander Cadogan set his sights on Edward Bridges, who did not speak, but just nodded, indicating that this was the intention of all cabinet members. The situation faced by the Potsdam Conference is very similar to that of the Paris Peace Conference. The difference is that the original France has been replaced by the current Soviet Union. Due to the lessons learned from the past, the United States and Britain are very worried about the recurrence of the tragedy. The United States believes that there are serious problems with the solution to the German reparations issue after World War I. Although the Dawes Plan reduced Germany's burden, it ignored the fact that Britain and France also owed the United States a huge debt. It is equivalent to the United States paying Germany's reparations to finance compensation to Britain and France, and Britain and France then used it to pay the United States. Therefore, the German reparations did not help Europe's revival at all, but instead exacerbated Europe's political turmoil. Britain and the United States have similar views, but from different angles. Britain's views are a combination of economic development and strategic planning. Out of concern about the Soviet Union's expansion into Western Europe, Britain, like after World War I, does not want Germany to be overly weakened, so rebuilding Germany is imperative. That is to say, Britain is more eager to rebuild Germany than the United States, but now it has no money. That is to say, how we treated France in the past, we should treat the Soviet Union now. Efort felt that he had understood the key. In fact, the The United States is playing the role of our British Empire back then, and the Soviet Union is in the environment of France, but in terms of strength, we may be more suitable for France at the Paris Peace Conference this time. Edward Bridges shook his head and instructed the diplomats, in this situation, balancing the opinions of the United States and the Soviet Union is a very test of ability. Okay, let's adjourn the meeting first. The conference room was empty. Alexander Cadogan accompanied Edward Bridges out, following closely behind and said, "Sir Edward, these diplomats are facing such an important international conference for the first time, so it is understandable that they have not thought about some things carefully." Of course it's understandable. Edward Bridges kept walking and said without looking back, "Do you think I'm worried about their lack of experience? That's not important. I'm worried about our Prime Minister, who thought this was just a simple repetition of the Paris Peace Conference and blindly forced the Soviets regardless of the current situation in the country. You just said that we are now more like the French before. Do you mean the Prime Minister?" Alexander Cadogan was a little surprised. He really didn't think of this. What else? You don't think the Paris Peace Conference is a meeting of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister from morning till night every day? Edward Bridges looked back with a very unprofessional look. It was us diplomats who negotiated, and the success of the negotiation only gave the politicians a chance to sign. Chapter 84. Yes, Prime Minister. Edward Bridges, who had worked in Whitehall for many years, was already immune to the Prime Ministers, who were always in a hurry. He believed that there was no such thing as a genius. It was a mistake for Prime Minister Chamberlain to raise Germany. Was it right for Prime Minister Churchill to sell his blood to resist? Sir Edward, even for the sake of correctness, we can only recognize Prime Minister Churchill's idea. Alexander Cadogan smiled bitterly. He admitted in his heart that Edward Bridges' idea was correct, but he couldn't say it out loud. Yes, this is the limitation of our affairs officers. We are just executing. Even if we oppose, we can't oppose it openly. Edward Bridges said helplessly, "It's not that I haven't reminded the Prime Minister that the current situation of the British Empire is really bad, but you also know that the Prime Minister is a stubborn person. If it weren't for Churchill's stubbornness, British citizens might not have united and resisted to the end during the war. But it's not good to be stubborn all the time." In Edward Bridges' eyes, Churchill is a person who doesn't know how to adapt. Cecilienhof Palace has been designated as the palace for the Potsdam Conference. Although the entire building has 176 rooms, it is almost invisible from the outside. It does look like a country villa. After entering the large archway of Cecilienhof Palace, the first thing you see is a green ground with a large circle of grass in the middle with a white pentagram outside. There are 5 red brick chimneys in series on the roof on the right, which are particularly conspicuous and look huge and heavy. They are the architectural symbol of Cecilienhof Palace. The main building with a triangular structure wall on the front is the meeting place designated for Potsdam. It looks a little simple, but during the time of Frederick the Great, it was as important as Berlin. It had a summer palace, office space, and court residence. Its status is similar to Versailles or Fontainebleau in France. The size of the palace is indeed not suitable for the leaders of the United Kingdom, the United States and the Soviet Union, but there is no way around it. Now the urban area of Berlin has been plowed by the Soviet Red Army's heavy artillery, and there are ruins everywhere. It is okay for military parades, but there is really no complete palace for the leaders of the 3 countries to have a quiet conversation. At noon on June 26th, a plane with a British emblem landed on the runway at Berlin Airport. Prime Minister Churchill and the current British Foreign Secretary Robert Anthony Eden came together. Edward Bridges, who had recently complained about Churchill himself, was also in the team below. With his iconic bulldog expression, Churchill, who might have made great achievements if he turned to gangsters, walked down as the Prime Minister of the British Empire and saw Edward Bridges, the Cabinet Secretary, in front of the crowd at a glance. "Sir Edward, are you ready?" Churchill asked with a deliberately strong expression. "Yes, Prime Minister." Edward Bridges was completely different from when he was with the Foreign Ministry Secretary before. With a gentle smile, he introduced the current situation in Berlin and the preparations for many days. "Then we will have a real negotiation with the opponents of the British Empire." Churchill recounted his grand blueprint and left the airport with Edward Bridges and Foreign Secretary Robert Anthony Eden. Alan Wilson was just an inconspicuous character in the team of diplomats responsible for the Potsdam Conference, and he followed behind everyone. However, compared with Churchill's classic image, he paid more attention to Foreign Secretary Robert Anthony Eden. If nothing unexpected happens, he will meet this second-in-command of the Conservative Party frequently during the next meeting. He is the person who was humiliated by the United States and the Soviet Union in the Suez Canal War, Alan Wilson muttered in his heart. The Suez Canal War was a key event in the handover of power. Britain and France formed a coalition and joined Israel to fight against Egypt, the leader of Arab countries, but they were eventually forced to give in. From then on, in the eyes of the world, they were no longer worthy of being compared with the United States and the Soviet Union. It was after the Suez Canal War that Britain allowed the independence of its colonies step by step and finally completely retreated to the British Isles, becoming a follower of the United States. Because Berlin was no longer as prosperous as before, in order to avoid delaying the good mood of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, the motorcade arranged by Cabinet Secretary Edward Bridges did not pass through the city of Berlin, but took a detour to Potsdam. Entering the Sitzlinhof Palace, Edward Bridges told Churchill the current news. The Soviet side has sent a telegram. Soviet leader Stalin himself and Molotov have set off, and the Soviets are coming from the land route. As for the United States, US President Truman is expected to arrive tomorrow. According to current news, the Secretary of State will not accompany him. It seems that there have been frequent personnel changes in the US government recently. Truman will arrive tomorrow, which is good. Before Stalin arrives, I want to communicate with our allies first, so that it may be easier to face the Soviets together. Churchill nodded, thinking that this was a good start. This is Alan. He will follow the Foreign Secretary during the conference. Edward Bridges waved Alan Wilson over and introduced him to Foreign Secretary Robert Anthony Eden. Alan has overseas work experience and has studied at the Oriental College. He is very familiar with the customs and practices of the Far East, India and the Middle East. He also has a certain understanding of the Soviet Union. He is a rare young talent. Robert Eden nodded slightly and said, diplomats working overseas are very similar to Alexander. Alexander Cadogan, the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was once the ambassador to China. Robert Eden was very familiar with the resume of the permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. These are the diplomats who will conduct negotiations during the conference. Edward Bridges introduced the others in detail. We will safeguard the interests of the British Empire together. Churchill raised his head and said with a hint of toughness, yes, Prime Minister. The diplomats who were holding the Potsdam Conference made a promise to Churchill. On June 27th, the plane of US President Harry S. Truman arrived in Berlin. Compared with his famous predecessor, President Roosevelt, this was Truman's first time to attend an important international conference abroad. His opponents were Stalin of the Soviet Union and Churchill of the United Kingdom. It would be a lie to say that he was not nervous. But as soon as Truman arrived in Potsdam, he was dispelled by the warm welcome expressed by Churchill. Truman nodded in agreement with Churchill's words about the special relationship between Britain and the United States, but did not give a positive response. Recommended book, titled My Good Brothers of the Ming Dynasty. It is a novel about the early Ming Dynasty. I will not post the introduction, because many authors write introductions that are really average. Chapter 85 Potsdam Conference. Due to some common positions towards the Soviet Union, the British and American diplomatic representative teams had a brief communication before the Soviet delegation arrived, so they knew each other's basic bottom line, especially the bottom line facing the Soviet Union. Alan Wilson was not a direct negotiator. His current duties were similar to those before. He was a liaison officer between Foreign Secretary Robert Anthony Eden and negotiating diplomats including Effort. In other words, he was a messenger who conveyed the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary's intentions to the diplomats who directly participated in the negotiations. Alan Wilson cherished this opportunity very much, and his heart was inspired by the glorious years of the British Empire for 300 years. For example, the relationship between civil servants and politicians in the election country should not be too rigid. If politicians want to tear their faces, they can also take action against cabinet secretaries, but they generally don't do so. The photo of Churchill and Truman standing side by side will immediately appear on the pages of major British newspapers. Alan Wilson had no doubt about this. The general election was about to come, and Churchill would not miss this opportunity. In fact, the Americans are most concerned about the war against Japan. They have communicated with us on this issue and hope that we can take a common position here to promote the Soviet Union's war against Japan. Alan Wilson reported the first-hand information to Foreign Secretary Robert Eden. It's similar to what I thought. This should be the main requirement of the United States to the Soviet Union at this stage. It can be expected that the Soviets will not agree so easily. Robert Eden nodded and said, Sir Edward said that you have a keen understanding of the Eastern problem. What do you think? That depends on what the Eastern problem is specifically. The East is huge. Although thinking so in his heart, Alan Wilson answered without stopping. It seems that the Soviet Union does not have a decent naval force. Can it swim to Japan? Yes, that's the problem. Robert Eden smiled and said, we will know during the negotiations. Alan Wilson nodded. In history, the general direction of the Potsdam Conference on the war against Japan was actually that the United States asked the Soviet Union at the beginning of the negotiations, and after the successful explosion of the nuclear bomb, the Soviet Union asked the United States. On the subject of fighting against Japan, Britain's attitude is to see it happen, but it will not be particularly concerned. Of course, Alan Wilson knew that General Mountbatten, who was still in British India, was actually very concerned and advocated an invasion of the Japanese mainland to settle accounts completely. Churchill and Robert Eden had different ideas, and were not interested in attacking the Japanese mainland, but they could support the Americans morally. The huge casualties caused by the attack on the Japanese mainland could make the Americans pay a little more. It was just a thought, but it could not be said out loud. Expecting Japan and the United States to fight to the death, and for the United States and the Soviet Union to attack Japan together was the future expected by the British Empire. As for the Americans' ideas, if they wanted Japan to surrender, they had to give Japan a major military blow, otherwise Japan would not surrender. The main countries fighting against Japan were China and the United States. The United States had the ability to counterattack, but the price was too high and the United States was unwilling to do so. In addition, Britain also fought against Japan in the Far East, but failed. Britain, which had just finished the European battlefield, had no ability to fight against Japan in the Far East again. So the United States could only ask the Soviet Union to declare war on Japan at this time, so that it could reduce its own pressure and make Japan surrender as soon as possible. On the issue of fighting against Japan, Britain hoped that the United States and the Soviet Union would attack Japan, and the United States also hoped that the Soviet Union would help it share the burden. As for the attitude of the Soviet Union, it is currently unclear. On the train to Berlin, in Stalin's compartment, Molotov was holding a stack of documents, which were also the Soviet Union's position, to be stated at the Potsdam Conference. Comrade Molotov, the United States must have been very eager at the beginning to deal with the issue of fighting against Japan. Although we have decided to join, we cannot easily agree. We mainly emphasize the division of Europe to divert Truman's attention. Stalin said indifferently. Beria said that with our current merchant ship strength, it is actually very difficult to support the war against Japan. We can't let the Americans transport our soldiers to Japan, so we lose the initiative. I think we can think of a way from Germany. Molotov thought for a while and said, ask Britain and the United States to deliver all the remaining merchant ships in Germany to the Soviet Union as compensation. The Soviet Union is really not good at marine power. Before the outbreak of the war, commercial transport ships only had 1.3 million tons, and now it has become 1.4 million tons after the war. Not to mention that it can't be compared with Britain and the United States. It is not even at the same level, compared with the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan, each with a tonnage of 4 to 5 million. The war has continued for many years, and the commercial transport ships of Germany, Italy, and Japan have almost been lost. Maybe the Axis powers, which each had a fleet of 4 to 5 million tons before the war, are not as good as the current Soviet Union. Good idea. Although this is our goal, we must pay attention to the methods. Stalin nodded in approval. In this way, with the German fleet, the transportation capacity for the war against Japan should be sufficient. The first communication between Britain and the United States in Berlin has been completed, and it is impossible to know what the Soviets who are still on the way think. However, Alan Wilson is really clear about the tonnage of the fleet alone. Germany currently has 800,000 tons of fleet that can be used. Compared with the scale of nearly 5 million before the war, it has lost more than 80%, but it depends on how to use it. Whether the Japanese Navy still has oil is a problem. If the warships cannot be supplied with oil, what is the use of warships? On June 28, the train carrying the Soviet delegation arrived in Berlin. Then Stalin and Molotov led the Soviet delegation to Potsdam and arrived at Cäcilenhof Palace. At this point, Stalin, one of the three giants, arrived at the Potsdam Conference. On the lawn of Cäcilenhof Palace, the three giants of the Allied powers, Stalin, Churchill and Truman, stood side by side, smiling and letting the surrounding reporters take pictures. The kind father of all nations, Alan Wilson, not far away, said words that only he could hear with a twitch of his mouth, while the leaders of the three countries accepted a group photo. To show the unity of the Allies, the negotiators of the United States, Britain and the Soviet Union also walked into the venue. The Potsdam Conference officially kicked off. The first round of talks began. Simply put, everyone said their own things. Because of the different questions raised, the division of camps could change at any time, and the United States did not stand on the side of the British on all issues. The previous special relationship between Britain and the United States disappeared after the meeting began. Britain and the United States opposed the Soviet Union, the United States and the Soviet Union opposed Britain, and Britain opposed the United States and the Soviet Union. The first day of the meeting was basically no progress. Chapter 86 US request. It is hard to imagine that when the leaders of the United States, Britain and the Soviet Union posed for the camera, such a scene appeared in the conference hall of the three countries. However, basic mathematical logic and the history of the three countries have proved that triangles are stable. It is difficult to make breakthrough progress when everyone is talking to themselves. Our diplomats have had frank exchanges with the United States and the Soviet Union, and each country has also put forward constructive opinions. Alan Wilson changed the subject and said to Foreign Secretary Robert Eden, keeping his hands on his chest and holding the document bag, "Our first proposal opposed by the United States and the Soviet Union was the proposal to threaten the Soviets by occupying the area of the Soviet-occupied zone. It's not surprising that the Soviets opposed it." Foreign Secretary Robert Eden smiled bitterly. He didn't agree with Prime Minister Churchill's blatant threat, but Churchill was the Prime Minister and both of them were in the Conservative Party, so he could only let it go. Well, to be exact, it was the Americans who were against it. The Americans expressed their respect for the division plan of the Yalta Conference and opposed the one-sided, irrational, and unilateral demands of the British Empire that destroyed the spirit of unity. Alan Wilson recalled the words the Americans said and repeated them verbatim. "I knew that the Americans were untrustworthy. They were simply humiliating us." Robert Eden couldn't help but complain when he heard it. He thought that the first objection would definitely come from the Soviet Union, but he didn't expect it to come from the United States. Just yesterday, President Truman, who arrived in Berlin, had a good chat with Prime Minister Churchill. Alan Wilson remained silent. The two young men from the United States and the Soviet Union had no moral principles and attacked the old comrade of the British Empire, which had ruled the world for more than 300 years. However, from the perspective that heretics are more hateful than pagans, it is not difficult to understand. There is nothing new under the sun. Alan Wilson just listened to the complaints of the foreign minister in front of him. Robert Eden must have just talked, because the Suez Canal War proved that a person can fall into the same pit twice. Minister, the topic most mentioned by Americans is the Soviet Union's war against Japan. In Alan Wilson's opinion, occupying a piece of Soviet-occupied territory is just a small issue and should not be the focus of the Potsdam Conference. He reminded, "I heard that the Americans suffered heavy losses in the just concluded Battle of Okinawa. Strictly speaking, Okinawa is not the Japanese mainland. The tragic casualties have left the Americans with lingering fears. If the Japanese mainland is attacked, the casualties of the US military are incalculable. From today's first round of meetings, it can be seen that the United States needs the Soviet Union. So it is not a good idea to insist on attacking the Soviet Union first. The Battle of Okinawa actually just ended a few days ago. This landing battle lasted 82 days. The attacking side was the US military and the defending side was the Japanese army. Although the US military finally wiped out the 100,000 Japanese troops defending the island, it also suffered nearly 80,000 casualties. This is an appalling number for the United States. You know, the previous Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima battles were equally fierce, but the US military lost less than 20,000 people in total. What shocked the US military the most was actually the Kikusu operation launched by the Japanese army before and after the Battle of Okinawa. 10 suicide squads were mobilized successively, becoming the pioneers of the Peace Church. The suicide attack method of mutual destruction shocked the US military before and after the Battle of Okinawa. Although the battle was won in the end, the Americans were deeply afraid of the Japanese soldiers' madness and mutual destruction. The US military had never encountered such an opponent in the world. A small Okinawa was already like this. If they really landed on the Japanese mainland, how many soldiers would the United States, which had not suffered much damage in the World War, lose? Alan, the American representative, wants us to attend a cocktail party together. At this time, a British diplomat pushed the door open and invited, the Americans should want to communicate with us. Alan Wilson looked at Robert Eden, got the latter's approval, turned around and replied, "Of course we can't refuse our close allies." After the door was closed again, Robert Eden said, "They should hope that we can support them in the war against Japan. If nothing unexpected happens, it should be like this." Alan Wilson nodded with a smile. Today the Soviet Union mainly mentioned the issue of European rights and interests, and it seems that they have no interest in the Far East. From the psychological point of view, that the more you emphasize something, the less you have, it seems that the Soviet Union is now paying more attention to Europe. You go and see what the Americans think first, and come back and tell me. Robert Eden sighed. As the foreign minister, Robert Eden's position is actually very awkward now. This is not a problem of Britain itself, but the problem comes from the United States. The current United States actually has no Secretary of State. Originally, there was one, but recently for some unknown reason, there happened to be a vacancy for the Secretary of State. Prime Minister Churchill showed solidarity with Truman of the United States and Stalin of the Soviet Union. Robert Eden could only fight against Molotov on equal terms. If the United States had a Secretary of State and came to Germany, the situation he was facing would be much better. After all, it was still the honeymoon period of the Allies. Potsdam was not short of cocktail parties symbolizing celebration. Although the positions of the three countries were not completely consistent, they were still acceptable on the surface. However, compared with the lobby downstairs belonging to politicians, the atmosphere in the small hall on the second floor, where the representatives of various countries were located, was a little inferior. There was no way around it. There were almost no intact palaces in Germany. Although the Sitzleinhof Palace was not grand enough, it could only be used as a makeshift one. Being small also had its advantages, as it could allow for some information exchange. Bang! After clinking glasses with the US Assistant Secretary of State, Alan Wilson asked, "James, why didn't your US Secretary of State come to Germany? This would make us lose an extra helper during the negotiations, and add some unnecessary obstacles." Alan, I don't know why. On June 27th, Secretary of State Edward Stettinius was dismissed by the president. James Jones shrugged helplessly. Now there is only an acting political officer, Joseph Crew. In fact, I heard that James Burns was very popular as Secretary of State, but President Truman did not wait for the Secretary of State to be appointed and came directly to Germany. Alan Wilson nodded in understanding. He didn't know if this kind of thing had happened before, but it was too coincidental that it happened at this time. It was just 10 days earlier than in history, and it happened. Of course, we still hope that Britain will support the US position, especially on the issue of fighting against Japan. We can solve other problems later. The most important issue now is to end the World War. Alan, what do you think? James Jones said sincerely. Well, Alan Wilson took a sip from the wine glass, and he didn't know what he was thinking in his heart. The United States is more anxious about the issue of fighting against Japan than imagined. Chapter 87. Great Britain has its own national conditions. It is not completely useless to talk to yourself at the conference. This is a necessary process of trial. At present, the United States focuses on the issue of fighting against Japan, while the Soviet Union talks about European issues, including the newly emerged refugee crossing. It may be the internal changes in the United States caused by the death of President Roosevelt. Anyway, in this meeting, the United States overemphasized the issue of fighting against Japan, which has given the Soviet Union an excuse. As for the position of the British Empire, Alan Wilson said, to be honest, there are still many positions, but the theme expressed in any single position is not clear. Britain believes that many issues are important, but some issues are emphasized by the United States and some by the Soviet Union. The role of the British Empire at the Potsdam Conference is really like a troublemaker. Alan Wilson held a wine glass and thought while saying, in fact, with the ability of the United States, it can fight independently. There are always deaths in war. It is really not easy to deceive the Soviet Union to sacrifice. Although the dying counterattack of the Japanese army in the Battle of Okinawa scared the US military, but in Alan Wilson's view, is the Japanese will to resist really strong? In fact, it is not certain. Maybe when the US military really invades the Japanese mainland, it will find that the resistance of the Japanese army is not as strong as in Okinawa. It is not necessarily true to use the losses in the Battle of Okinawa to calculate the cost of attacking Japan. It's just that the United States dare not gamble. Of course, Alan Wilson talked about this matter in a tone that he was not afraid of back pain, which soon caused the dissatisfaction of James Jones. Mr. Allen, Britain keeps saying that it wants to take a common position with the United States, but the help it has taken in the war against Japan is limited. This is not the attitude of a close ally. Britain does this because it wants to leave the honor and joy of defeating Japan to the United States. This can't be said to be wrong. Alan Wilson denied it flatly. Seeing that the other party did not believe it, he could only add one more sentence. Besides, Britain has no interests in the Far East, and we really can't help much. Although the Japanese Navy can be regarded as completely destroyed, the Japanese troops in Southeast Asia are isolated and helpless. But the British Indian coalition forces are indeed far away from the Japanese mainland. Didn't the United States also fail to deal with the Japanese troops in Southeast Asia? Now the Japanese troops in the Philippines are still surrounded, and the US military has not wiped out the Japanese troops who refuse to surrender. Alan Wilson used this incident to refute James Jones's words. He even wanted to tell him that until Japan surrendered unconditionally, the US military did not completely wipe out the Japanese troops in the Philippines. Is it only about interests when it comes to ending the war? James Jones asked dissatisfiedly. Great Britain has its own national conditions. Alan Wilson put down his wine glass and spread his hands helplessly. And you also know that Britain is an island country and is not good at its army. Landing warfare is still the strength of the United States. If you don't believe me, you can recall Operation Overlord, which is a firm proposition of the United States. Alan, our president has just taken office and is attending an international conference for the first time. What the citizens at home need now is good news. From the three parties attending the conference this time, the relationship between the United States and Britain is at least obviously better than the relationship with the Soviet Union, right? James Jones took a deep breath and said in a different tone, the United States needs Britain's help now, especially on the issue of fighting Japan. The Soviet Union is using the Yugoslavia issue to put pressure on the United States. Is Britain just watching from the sidelines? This is an American problem. It was General Patton who took in Tito's opponents. When Alan Wilson heard this question, his tone became tough. He was the one who caused this matter, so he was resistant to this topic in his heart. But as long as Alan Wilson didn't admit it, no one would doubt him. After so many days, he had figured out why the storm turned into a gentle rain. It must be related to the struggle between Eisenhower and Patton. It can only be said that the timing was coincidental. On the one hand, Eisenhower and Patton in Europe had different attitudes after the war. On the other hand, President Truman had just come to power in the United States and was not familiar with many things. The vacancy of the Secretary of State just now proved this point. Of course, I will inform the Foreign Secretary of the attitude of the Americans without reservation. In terms of the big position, Britain and the United States must be consistent. Alan Wilson changed his tone and said that he would try his best to maintain this special unity. Since the Americans were so eager to join the Soviet Union and were willing to make concessions, Alan Wilson had no reason to refuse. This was the Americans' own fault. It's the same problem. The Americans urgently need the Soviet Union to join the war against Japan. He returned to Foreign Secretary Robert Eden and reported, "The tone is very urgent. It can be seen that for now, this is the most concerned issue for the United States. They hope that we can help put pressure on the Soviet Union. But the Prime Minister attaches more importance to European issues and believes that the Soviet Union should first accept the status quo on European issues." Robert Eden frowned and said, "The order of the Americans is the opposite of ours. Dear Foreign Secretary, in fact, if the problem of fighting against Japan is solved, the problem on the European side can also be solved. Since a great ally has just expressed the need for help, how dare Alan Wilson destroy the special relationship between Britain and the United States?" He said, "In fact, we once had similar hopes for the Germans, making the Germans a problem for the Soviets." "What do you mean? Divert the trouble to others?" Robert Eden understood it as soon as he heard it. He was already Foreign Secretary at the age of 38. The decision maker who made Germany find trouble with the Soviet Union was himself. "That's what I said, Minister. We all know that the Soviet Union is a strong land power and now has a powerful military force. It is easiest to bring out the Soviet Union's strengths on the vast plains of Europe. And Japan is an island country." Alan Wilson said, neither humbly nor arrogantly, from a completely neutral perspective. "If the war against Japan can start immediately, the Soviet Union's attention will be diverted from Europe. Moreover, the Soviet Union's naval power is weak, and the same garrison will be in a situation without backup on the island country." Robert Eden nodded in approval. When he heard Alan Wilson mention diverting trouble to others, he, who had led similar decisions before, was no longer sleepy. He said with approval, "The needs of the United States allies are indeed more reasonable than those of the Prime Minister." "Yes, Minister." Alan Wilson smiled knowingly. In fact, the Prime Minister must have been mentioned about the war against Japan by President Truman. For the sake of maintaining precious relations with American allies, Robert Eden took over the words. "Gentlemen never avoid their mistakes, do they?" Chapter 88, Selling Poland Again. "A gentleman never avoids his mistakes." Alan Wilson was full of admiration. Why could the other party be the second in command of the Conservative Party and the Foreign Secretary at the age of 38? This was the reason. Then on the issue of fighting against Japan, we must understand what the Soviets need and adopt the method of extreme pressure. Alan Wilson mentioned extreme pressure, and a strange look appeared on his face. Why did he feel like he was possessed by the King of Understanding? "I will find effort to explain this matter now." Robert Eden and Alan Wilson said that Churchill was informed by Truman. It was not false. Since Prime Minister Churchill met with President Truman, he did hear President Truman constantly, hoping that Britain would support the Soviet Union in joining the war against Japan. "I hope that the first consensus that the entire Potsdam Conference can come up with is that the Soviet Union will officially join the war against Japan after the end of the European battlefield. The mood is simply undisguised urgency. According to normal development, the Soviet Union can indeed use this to bargain with the United States to obtain more favorable conditions, but this is according to normal development." Alan Wilson actually knew that things were fleeting, because the Manhattan Project had reached its final moment. Just one day before the Pearl Harbor incident, the United States officially formulated a top-secret plan codenamed Manhattan. President Roosevelt gave this plan special priority over all actions. Because the time was too coincidental, the Manhattan Project also became evidence of the United States' dishonesty in the mouths of conspiracy theorists. Alan Wilson didn't care what the conspiracy theory was, but he knew that for the British Empire, even if the Soviet Union's powerful land force in Europe was reduced by 1 point, it would be good. As the main battlefield between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, Europe also needed a place to relieve pressure and share the pressure in Europe. Japan, which was still resisting, was the best choice. As for the final fate of the Japanese, Alan Wilson, as a citizen of the British Empire, could not consider it for the time being. Just like the Germans chose Hitler to lead Germany to start a war, the Japanese could shout out the slogan of 100 million people dying in glory, and they should pay a certain price. Once the United States and the Soviet Union occupied part of Japan respectively, they would definitely share the current pressure in Europe. And unlike so many countries in Europe that were forced to choose sides, the United States and the Soviet Union could completely rely on their own national strength to confront each other in Japan. Prime Minister Churchill returned to his room later and talked with Foreign Secretary Robert Eden. He also mentioned Truman's wish for the Soviet Union to join the war and did not forget to emphasize, "I still think that we should first clarify the European issue. Winston, in fact, this is the same problem as the one we faced with Germany." After all, Robert Eden was Churchill's comrade in arms for many years and knew the Prime Minister's temper. Although Churchill had a bad temper, he was not a person who could not communicate. It is better for us to divert the attention of the Soviets than to chatter here. The Americans have learned from the Battle of Okinawa that Japan is not easy to mess with. The Soviets don't know that the direction of the war cannot be controlled. As long as the first battle between the Soviet Union and Japan begins, it will not be so easy to end it. The huge army now in Eastern Europe will continue to move to the Far East, and our biggest problem will be solved. If the Soviet Union does not join the war against Japan, Truman may focus on us in Britain. Don't look at me like that. This is all possible. So do we have to travel thousands of miles to accompany the US military to the Far East to fight? You know the situation at home. Robert Eden was so sincere in front of Churchill that he had the style of a later conservative prime minister. He used all the rhetoric he had cultivated as foreign minister on Churchill. But Stalin said that the Soviet Union did not have enough sea power to transport the army to Japan. Churchill spread his hands and said, "That's true. The Soviet Union's sea power is indeed not worth mentioning. But I remember that the Soviet Union's Sakhalin Island is only 30 kilometers away from Japan." Robert Eden raised his eyebrows. Even the German heavy artillery during World War I had this range. Hokkaido and Honshu Island are even shorter than this distance. What does this mean? During the Dunkirk evacuation, countless British citizens drove fishing boats out to sea and joined the Dunkirk evacuation. Robert Eden made his own judgment. The Soviet Union is blackmailing us. In fact, with the British Empire's sea power in Asia, it is completely possible to transport Soviet soldiers to Japan. The British Empire certainly has this power. The tonnage of the commercial transport fleet currently maintained in the country is 17 million tons. It is 2/3 of the 30 million tons of commercial fleet of the United States. Although its naval power in Asia cannot be compared with the large fleets in Europe, it is easy to deal with the Japanese navy that has been stranded. Churchill and Robert Eden have a common language in shifting pressure and giving the British Empire a chance to breathe. Now that I heard Robert Eden want to copy the plan of diverting the trouble to the east, I have already felt a little moved. Robert Eden has already explained that if the Soviets do not land on the island, it will be the British who will go on the island and play with the Americans. Because of this most simple reason, the Soviets must land on the island. But we don't have many cards in our hands. Churchill recalled the current situation in Britain and said dryly, "Stalin is not a person who is easily deceived." Yes, Robert Eden said with a thoughtful look on his face. The Polish government in exile is still in London. Stalin attaches so much importance to Poland. We can use the Polish issue to bargain with the Soviet Union. In the first round of meetings, didn't the Soviet Union still hope that we would approve the solution to the border between Poland and Germany? This can be used. There is no doubt that Robert Eden thought of the Polish issue. Anyway, at the previous Yalta conference Britain had already betrayed Poland once. In this case, for the sake of the overall situation of world peace, it is better to sell it out more thoroughly. Entering the field he is good at, Robert Eden seemed to have opened up his meridians at once. The whole of Poland was sold, so what was there to do with leaving an exiled government in London? Politicians are ruthless, and General Patton had experienced it before. Alan Wilson didn't know that the British version was about to be staged. He was showing his keyboard warrior nature and discussing the plan to attack Japan with F4. Being a complete military illiterate, he naturally wrote casually, F4 really dared to join in the discussion. After all, professionalism was not important. The only goal was to catch the Soviets off guard. That night, the British delegation was brightly lit. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 89, Who to Sell This Time. With Alan Wilson's military expertise, the plan to fight against Japan can be simply summarized as follows. The Japanese army is a scumbag, the Red Army is invincible, and wherever they go, they will surrender. As for how much preparation the Soviet Union itself has made in the Eastern battlefield, he has no relevant information, so of course he is completely in the dark. It is almost an idea to send it ashore and then ignore it. F4, who also has a good performance in the military, nodded frequently and felt that it made a lot of sense. Since it is blackmail, it does not need any professionalism. If the Americans saw this plan, they might directly protest against Britain. This is not to die, there is nothing, just relying on courage to charge. However, if the Soviet Union is asked to do this, the United States will not object. It is well known that the Soviet Red Army has a strong spirit of sacrifice. Alan Wilson, with his military blindness, dared to let the Soviet Union attack Japan. It must be said that he showed a courage that was almost stupid, and it can only be said that his courage is commendable. But the Soviet Red Navy doesn't seem to be able to complete the landing cover. But there should be no problem with the Air Force. F4 nodded and said, it depends on how much defense power Japan has on the mainland. But then again, Germany still had 7 to 8 million troops before surrendering. Japan's population is not less than Germany, so there should be so many. I believe this is why the United States is eager for the Soviet Union to join the war. Maybe so. Alan Wilson agreed with his colleague's idea, although he knew in his heart that it was false. Hokkaido is located in the low cold zone. As of the 21st century, the entire Hokkaido population is only more than 5 million. During World War II, the Japanese population was 78 million, and in the 21st century it was close to 130 million. According to this ratio, Hokkaido now has only 3 to 4 million people. With such a small population, and Hokkaido should be the last in the sequence of the decisive battle of the Japanese mainland, how many troops can it have? Hokkaido's population is insufficient for sure. Alan Wilson remembered that Hokkaido was the main place where Japan plundered laborers, because the local population was insufficient, and could not afford the labor force for Japan's development of Hokkaido. Compared with its insignificant population, Hokkaido is the largest island in Japan besides Honshu Island, and its area is no smaller than the Soviet-occupied zone in Germany. If the Americans hadn't always put pressure on us to put the war against Japan in the first place, who would care about their business? After deciding to change the content of the talks, Alan Wilson began to shirk responsibility. This was not shirking responsibility. It was originally the Americans' request. Britain just respected the opinions of its close allies and went with the flow. Yes, we were supposed to talk about European affairs. F4 also agreed. This was not part of the British negotiation sequence. It was the Americans who insisted on talking about the war against Japan first. Then all the consequences that appeared afterwards were ultimately caused by the Americans themselves. Alan Wilson had no time to worry about the Americans. After the map was opened, Alan Wilson sat down with his friends and asked about the negotiations during the day so that he could go back and summarize and write files the next day. There is no doubt that everyone will get what they want after this meeting. Alan Wilson's words were meaningful. Who doesn't know that this will add glory to the resume and make an immeasurable contribution to future development? This credit belongs to all the hard-working diplomats. F4 smiled, but did not deny it. He said to himself, I wonder where I will work after this meeting. Maybe there is a place for you in the French embassy. Alan Wilson joked to the pioneer of insulting France. This joke is not funny. Effa couldn't help laughing when he heard it. He stood up to let Effa rest. Alan Wilson returned to his room and pushed the door open. He was startled. The person in front of him was wearing a pair of black framed glasses and looked at him indifferently. Who else could it be but Cabinet Secretary Edward Bridges? Turning around and carefully closing the door, Alan Wilson cautiously said, "Sir Edward, why are you here?" "Why?" Surprised, Edward Bridges leaned over, satisfied with the reaction of the young man in front of him, and said calmly, "I came here for my own purpose. I could actually ask Alexander to come, but considering the urgency of the matter, it's better for me to come here in person. I'm not very old. For a cabinet secretary who is motivated to serve the country, it's not just young, it's in the prime of life." Alan Wilson took advantage of the situation and used the words of the cabinet secretary as a guide. "But people can't always stay in the same position. I'm deeply worried about some phenomena in the current civil service system." Edward Bridges' face flashed a trace of worry. "Young people should get more exercise, right?" Alan Wilson's mind raced. He didn't think that a cabinet secretary suddenly appeared in front of him at this time, just to instill some chicken soup. Edward Bridges didn't care. He pointed his finger at Alan Wilson to sit down and said slowly, "The negotiations have reached a deadlock. The United States and the Soviet Union have different focuses. Now is the time to break the deadlock. Some unconventional methods should be adopted. Sometimes, for a greater goal, some minor sacrifices are inevitable." When Alan Wilson heard that this was a mission, no matter what it was, he had no reason to refuse. The reason was simple. The cabinet secretary was the head of the civil servants. "Sir, I'm willing to make all preparations for the British Empire." Alan Wilson showed an attitude of not sparing anything. Edward Bridges was very satisfied and nodded. "The British Empire needs diplomats like you. It's like this. The Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary and I all think that, if we want to achieve results as soon as possible, we may need some private communication. Diplomats who negotiate directly are not suitable for this job, because it has to be done in secret. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, Alexander and I are all too ambitious. As a liaison officer, you will not be noticed. You are the most suitable candidate." "Me. I'm willing, but what is the purpose?" Alan Wilson agreed first regardless of the consequences, but he didn't know what his purpose was yet. "We hope that the Soviet Union will agree to fight against Japan immediately, and we will create an opportunity for you to do this." Edward Bridges said word by word, "You reach a consensus with the Soviets in private. Isn't this the Munich conspiracy?" Alan Wilson made a judgment as soon as he heard it, but who should he sell this time? Chapter 90, Backroom Operation. There are still many, such as the Polish government in exile, Yugoslav refugees, and the border issue between Poland and Germany. Edward Bridges enumerated the issues that the Soviet Union was concerned about. This task is very difficult, and it also tests your personal ability. Alan Wilson breathed a sigh of relief. In fact, these issues are indeed what the Soviet Union is concerned about. If the West does not recognize the changes in the border between Germany and Poland, the Soviet Union will have no reason to occupy eastern Poland. But then again, there are not many places where the UK can make an offer. At least on issues involving East Asia, the United States has more say than the United Kingdom. If it wants to sell, it is the Americans who sell, at least before Mr. Chung hooked up with Dewey. But I can't speak a word of Russian. How can I communicate with the other party? Alan Wilson was a little embarrassed, but it's not that he can't speak a word. For example, he is very proficient in the Russian word vocabulary. Things like black box operations are actually very different from formal negotiations. Just like at the Munich conference, we didn't let Czechoslovakia get useful information. We can just sign it when the time comes. Edward Bridges looked relaxed, letting the young commissioner who had just accepted the national mission relax. There has never been a time like today when Alan Wilson had the illusion of influencing the course of history. Once upon a time, his dream was actually just to make a fortune in British India, so that his future life would be guaranteed. But he did not expect that things would not go as he wished. He was pressured by Nehru and now he went to Europe to work hard for the British Empire. Even now, at such an important occasion as the Potsdam Conference, he still missed British India very much. After sending Edward Bridges away, Alan Wilson still couldn't fall asleep, thinking about how to achieve his goal tomorrow. In fact, there was only a short day before the meeting of the big three, although it seemed that a lot of things happened on this day. The three parties only expressed their opinions, and no one knew whether the other party's opinions were heard. The palace was brightly lit, indicating that the United States, Britain and the Soviet Union were actually summarizing today's negotiations, and Alan Wilson finally fell asleep. The dawn of June 29th woke Potsdam from silence. The big three were still talking and laughing. The miserable diplomats had to face their opponents and display their eloquence. Alan Wilson left Potsdam and headed for a village 7 kilometers southeast. This was a meeting point arranged by the Soviets. He was very nervous until he met the Soviet representative who was negotiating with him. A very attractive mature woman, dressed in a way that didn't even look like someone from a country like the Soviet Union. Swallow. KGB. Alan Wilson became alert and took the initiative to greet him. "You are the representative of the Soviet Union." "Hello, Mr. Allen." The person stretched out her hand and shook hands with Alan Wilson, introducing herself in English that was good enough for communication. "I'm Ekaterina Alexeyevna Furtseva, an ordinary Soviet woman. An ordinary woman negotiating with you should avoid your nervousness." Alan Wilson burped and forced a smile. "I ate too much this morning. I'm really sorry for my behavior just now." He was sure that the other party was not Swallow, but she was more difficult to deal with than Swallow. If it wasn't the same name, Ekaterina Alexeyevna Furtseva, the other party should be the Minister of Culture of the Soviet Union during Khrushchev's time. Rumor has it that Catherine III, Furtseva's most impressive achievement was to help Khrushchev turn defeat into victory. When Khrushchev was dismissed by the majority, she quickly gathered 10 people to request a central and plenary session on the matter by virtue of her long-term work in Moscow. After being rejected, she persuaded Zhukov to stand on her side. Within 2 days, 107 of the 130 representatives were airlifted to Moscow, and the situation was completely reversed. According to merit, she became the first female member of the Soviet high level the following year. Furtseva was born in 1910 and was already the head of the Moscow District Committee. With a mature charm, she saw the vigilance in Alan Wilson's eyes and smiled. "Is a representative of the British Empire timid? To be honest, who is not afraid of the Soviet Union now?" Alan Wilson smiled without embarrassment, sat down as the other party instructed, and said, "First of all, thank the Soviet Union for responding to the British Empire's request for exchanges. We will definitely reach a consensus on the issue of ending the war." "That's not necessarily the case, young diplomat." Furtseva looked at Alan Wilson with a smile and said, "You imperialist diplomats always say one thing and do another. Your hostility towards the Soviet Union has never changed. How can we believe you? Just less than 10 years ago, you, Britain and France, sold Czechoslovakia in Munich, didn't you? Beautiful lady, this is exactly the purpose of the Soviet Union's willingness to meet with us in Britain, isn't it? If we in Britain didn't sell anything, would we be meeting now?" Alan Wilson spoke confidently, raising his shameless style to a high level. Furtseva was startled and couldn't help but laughed out loud. "Mr. Allen is right. I wonder what suitable price you can offer to express the sincerity of the British Empire." Furtseva didn't enter the role of a negotiator for a while. In fact, she didn't know why she was sent to negotiate with Alan Wilson. She even felt strange when she recalled what happened yesterday. When the great leader heard Alan Wilson's name, he expressed his interest in this secret operation, and even asked Furtseva to make a report of all the dialogues in today's negotiations, and send it up when the time comes. "Of course the British Empire is very sincere," Alan Wilson said with an affirmative tone, and then said, "For example, the issue of the border between Poland and Germany, which is of most concern to the Soviet Union at present, although I don't know why the Soviet Union is so concerned about the European stepping mat, but since this is the case, we can talk about the Polish issue. Of course, since it is an exchange of interests, there is no such thing as concession in vain. The Soviet side must also show its sincerity. Of course, I have always believed that labor and rewards are proportional." Furtseva nodded in agreement, "But there must be a reason for doing everything. The war against Japan has a lot to do with the United States. It seems that Britain is not a party with the interests. Why is it so concerned? If this question is not answered, cooperation without any grudges may not be able to take place. The name Third Seaver is familiar. It has appeared in my previous book, Chapter 91, Soft and Hard. These Soviets. Alan Wilson shook his head in his heart. The world is inherently unequal, but there is such an alien country that insists on changing this fate. In Alan Wilson's eyes, it is simply crazy. Everyone unites under the banner of imperialism, turning all third world countries into colonies and enslaving the people there forever. This is what the imperialist powers should do. But obviously, there are two traitors of different degrees in the united imperialist camp now. One clamors to liberate the world, and the other wants national self-determination. There is no doubt that these two ideas are enemies of the British Empire. From the perspective of proposition, the Soviet Union should be the more urgent enemy, but considering that the European battlefield has just ended, and the Soviet Union has suffered serious internal injuries, the Soviet Union will not have the power to come and cause trouble if it does not heal its internal injuries within 10 years. The current Soviet Union cannot project power beyond the Eurasian continent. On the contrary, the American allies who keep talking about the special relationship between Britain and the United States are now really capable of threatening Britain's overseas colonies, and the Americans are really doing it. This is what Alan Wilson really thinks in his heart. On the issue of colonies, the United States is the most real enemy in the near future. Beautiful lady, if I were the Soviet Union, I should give Britain a chance to breathe. The Soviets should understand that Britain has been damaged in this war, just like the Soviet Union. After a long silence, Alan Wilson finally began to carry out substantive black box operations. Open blackmail is the business of F4's diplomats, not Alan Wilson's mission. Alan Wilson has no better way, so he can only use an honest attitude to let the Soviet Union understand the current situation. Britain has vast colonies. Third Seaver's lethal smile did not diminish, and she said in a pleasant voice, I thought the colonial empire in the past 300 years would be very strong. But Britain does not have a strong homeland after all, and we cannot compare with the Soviet Union and the United States in this regard. Alan Wilson stared into Third Seaver's eyes. In another situation, this might be the beginning of a relationship. Even if the other party is already 35 years old, she is still very charming and has a fatal attraction to men. But it's not possible now. Although Alan Wilson's previous operations in Yugoslavia benefited the Soviet Union, they were essentially for the consideration of the British Empire, wanting the United States to do more and stand in front against the Soviet Union. As a British, he was only loyal to the British Empire and never intended to serve the Cambridge Five to liberate the world. Third Seaver did not refute. After all, she was not a professional diplomat. The reason for her appearance here was actually the same as Alan Wilson, and she would not be noticed by others. So she carefully tasted every word Alan Wilson said and judged the honesty. When Alan Wilson mentioned the border issue between Poland and Germany, Third Seaver refuted for the first time. As early as 5 years ago, Britain had expressed understanding of the Soviet Union's occupation of eastern Poland, and that was originally part of Imperial Russia. It was only because of the war that we had to give up temporarily. Mr. Allen, it is untenable to use border changes at this time. The Curzon Line is named after your British Empire's Foreign Secretary Curzon. You won't forget it so quickly, right? How the hell do I know? Alan Wilson was dissatisfied. Why did Britain draw lines everywhere? As a commissioner of British India, he had never worked in Europe, so how could he know what was going on here? 25 years ago, when the Soviet Red Army repelled the Polish intervention forces, Curzon, on behalf of the British government, suggested that the Soviet Union use this line as the ceasefire line for peace talks. At the international conference held in Spa, both Poland and the Soviet Union recognized the Curzon Line as the Polish-Soviet border. When the Polish army launched a counterattack, the Polish government refused to recognize the Curzon Line. That idiot Piłsudski is not the one we support in attacking the Soviet Union. But when it comes to the Polish issue, we in Britain just mentioned the border line in passing. I believe the Soviet Union will like the real topic. Alan Wilson directly skipped the topic of territorial changes between Poland and Germany and put forward another condition. Oh, really? Third Seaver's big eyes blinked, and she asked in an inquiring tone. An old empire must have many valuable things to share. Of course, of course. After emphasizing it twice in a row, Alan Wilson stretched out his finger and boasted, "It's definitely an extra gain for the Soviet Union, Miss Furtsiva. There is now a Polish government in exile in London." Furtsiva's eyes lit up. Of course she knew about this, although in the previous transaction between Poland and Greece, the British side had sold Poland to the Soviet Union as a condition of exchange. But the existence of the Polish government in exile is always a hidden danger. Alan Wilson certainly knew this. After the Battle of Poland, the entire territory of Poland was lost. The troops that escaped from Poland were loyal to the Polish government in exile and participated in many wars. The Polish soldiers on the former Polish border organized the Polish underground state to fight against the German army on the former Polish border. Poland was occupied by the Soviet Red Army after World War II. Because the Polish government in exile did not have much negotiation with the Polish underground state, and the Soviet Union, Poland established a government supported by the Soviet Union, and the Polish government in exile could not return to Poland. The Polish government in exile persisted until the Soviet Union failed in the Cold War and finally returned to Poland. It is also because of the history of the Polish government in exile that Poland has always been the anti-Russian pioneer in Eastern Europe. However, unlike World War II, they have recognized the new father, the United States. The Polish government in exile has a strong influence on the Polish army abroad. There are 150,000 former government troops loyal to Poland. Alan Wilson said this, and then changed the subject, reminding Furtsiva, "I heard that a large number of bodies of Polish officers were found in a place called Katyn. I will not comment on who killed them. The Germans killed them and framed us." Furtsiva frowned and refuted righteously. "It doesn't matter who killed him. The key is whether anyone believes it. The Polish government in exile itself has strong anti-Russian ideas. If some of them use this to rally the people, it will be a problem." Alan Wilson analyzed from a third-party perspective. If such an exiled government is not under the control of the Soviet Union, Poland will not be stable, right? There are also hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers who obey the Polish government in exile, and the hatred of the Soviet-Polish War. There were also 3 partitions of Poland before that. There are too many things. Furtsiva frowned. Even if she hadn't heard about it, she could feel how much her father valued Poland. Chapter 92, The Killer. Once the Polish government in exile returns to Poland, whether they go to Siberia to build socialism is up to you Soviets. We will have nothing to do with them then. Otherwise, they would not have agreed to exchange Greece for Poland. Alan Wilson had been instructed by the cabinet secretary before coming here, and he had a full understanding of this. Britain recognized that Poland belonged to the Soviet Union, but keeping the Polish government in exile in London was equivalent to an opposition in the hands of the opponent, which was completely different from the Yugoslav problem that had just emerged. The difference was that Poland would definitely be stationed by the Soviet Red Army, while Yugoslavia was still in the hands of Tito, a leader who started his career in war. A country that was completely under his control. The Soviet Union certainly did not want to have an opposition in the hands of the opponent. Yugoslavia was now a suspicious ally of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was happy to see such a country with an opposition on the opposing side, and could only rely on itself to maintain security. Mr. Allen, even so, don't you think the British sincerity is still not enough? Furtsiva was not fooled by Alan Wilson's words. As long as it is a country, the official words are the same. She asked, war against Japan is what the United States hopes for most. Britain is willing to help, and even put the Polish government in exile on the negotiation table for this. Why? I didn't expect that I had already taken the initiative to ask the Poles to grow potatoes in Siberia, but I still couldn't impress the woman in front of me. Still asking for too much? Alan Wilson sighed in his heart. He still underestimated the greed of the Soviets. He asked back, Ms. Furtsiva, if the Soviet Union has any other requirements, just say it directly. We expect compensation from the German fleet, otherwise we, the Soviet Union, don't have the sea transportation capacity for landing. This request is not excessive, right? Japan is an island country, isn't it? Furtsiva looked at Alan Wilson straight in the eye, and didn't think her request was excessive. The German fleet went to Japan to fight. This reminds me of the Russo-Japanese War. Did the Soviet Union want to sail for 220 days before landing in Japan? To be honest, by the time the Soviet Union arrived in Japan, Japan would have surrendered. Based on my understanding of the Americans, with their superiority in the Navy and Air Force, the Americans would not give the Soviet Union even 1 square meter of land at that time. Alan Wilson analyzed calmly, and the Soviet Union has no possibility of counterattack. The Navy is too weak. Don't look at me with suspicion. Truman has just come to power and urgently needs to make some achievements. It is true that he is asking for help from the Soviet Union now, and it is also true that he will turn against the Soviet Union once he feels that he does not need the Soviet Union's help. For example, a president who has just come to power, or a person who inherits the president as vice president but lacks prestige, his behavior is completely unpredictable. I believe Ms. Furtsever also notes that the US Secretary of State did not show up at this important meeting. In fact, on June 27th, the former Secretary of State had just been transferred. In fact, he only needed to wait a few days. The new Secretary of State would take office, but Truman couldn't wait to come to Berlin. Doesn't this prove that he urgently needs to accumulate honors? At this point, Alan Wilson no longer cared about the special relationship between Britain and the United States. As long as the British Empire could get a chance to breathe, he didn't care about the United States. Anyway, the United States was not damaged by the war, and it was big and powerful enough to withstand the calculation. Alan Wilson, who claimed that he could not speak a word of Russian, kept talking nonsense to Furtsever. The latter could still resist at the beginning, but it was noon in a blink of an eye. Alan Wilson, who had eaten a little, seemed to have replenished some physical strength, but Furtsever found that the high energy of this negotiation had just begun. In order to get the Soviet Union to agree to start fighting against Japan immediately, Alan Wilson could be said to have sold out the United States completely. Before coming, Edward Bridges also gave Alan Wilson a certain degree of authorization. For example, he could agree to the Soviets to use Britain's naval power in Asia to complete the landing operation. In fact, even so, Edward Bridges felt that the Soviets might not agree to it if he betrayed the Polish government in exile, because this was a war that would risk their lives, not a child's play, and war would kill people. It is indeed not a great hope to force the Soviets to conduct a landing war, which the Soviets are not good at, by negotiation. On the evening of June 29th, in the Sicilian Hof Palace, Alan Wilson reported the process of today's secret operation in a moderate voice. Almost at the same time, Furtsever did the same thing as Alan Wilson, reporting to Stalin himself, and referring to Alan Wilson's high energy chattering since noon today. When he heard that Britain was prepared to use the Polish government in exile as a condition, Stalin showed no comment. Hearing the doubts about the massacre of the Poles in Katyn, Stalin's mouth twitched slightly, and he felt that the follow-up work of this matter should be handled cleanly, and no evidence should be left in the world for the enemy to make a fuss. When he heard the British proposal to repatriate the Yugoslavs, Stalin finally couldn't help laughing. He didn't want the opposition to return to Yugoslavia at all, and asked, "Any other interesting suggestions? Take your time, I'm not in a hurry." "Okay, Comrade Stalin, this person really said a lot of things. I will definitely report it in full." Furtsever recalled and began to repeat the high-energy conversation that started at noon. Among the powerful countries in the world today, only the United States has not suffered any damage. The United States now has strong economic and military power. Following Furtsever's words, Stalin made a gesture of listening attentively, judging the authenticity of these words in his mind. The United States can completely use its huge economic power to lead the reconstruction of Europe. No matter other countries or Britain and France have the ability to resist this. Economic reconstruction will inevitably bring military and political influence. Although this is just a hypothesis, it is not what the Soviet Union wants to see. The Soviet Union should not hope that Britain and France will be too weak. Once Britain and France are so weak that they have no resistance to the United States, and eventually become subordinate, whether Britain and France are willing or not, they will eventually become part of the blockade of the Soviet Union. This is very likely. Although it was just a hypothesis, Stalin remained calm on the surface, but he approved of this idea. Furtsever finally said, "Comrade Stalin." Before leaving, he said that the United States had an unprecedented weapon that had reached the final stage. If the Soviet Union does not respond now, when this weapon is successfully developed, the Soviet Union will lose all bargaining power. In my opinion, it is blackmail. Stalin's eyes fixed, and you could hear a pin drop in the room. Just when Furtsever was a little uneasy, she finally heard Stalin's order. "Everything today will always be a secret, Comrade Furtsever. Recommend Dalualo's new book, The Song Dynasty Has Kindness." Lualo's is also well known, and the book is still guaranteed. I won't post the introduction. Although I'm lazy, at the same time, books by this author don't need an introduction at all. In the final analysis, it's actually my laziness. Chapter 93. The Glorious Era is back. Stalin knew exactly how far the Manhattan Project of the United States had progressed. The news from the British side could only be regarded as a piece of evidence, and there was no need to verify it, because it was too important. It was so important that when Furtsever mentioned it, Stalin thought that the British side had shown their sincerity. Since it was a secret operation, there were naturally many differences from formal negotiations. Of course, Stalin would not be polite about the support he needed. Since the Americans took the initiative to ask for it, it would be a shame not to ask for more. In another room, Alan Wilson was reporting his achievements to Edward Bridges with great joy. Except for the big killer that was revealed at the end, there was nothing to hide. What interests were sold had already been decided long ago, and he was just a tool to notify the Soviet Union on behalf of Britain. I told the Soviets that the Americans just can't make up their minds yet. Once the Soviet Union fails to express its sincerity, the United States can fight independently with its current strength. Edward Bridges nodded and said slowly, "Ethel said in today's report that the Soviets have softened their tone and mentioned the idea of handing over the German commercial fleet to the Soviet Union as collateral. Then we can't agree. How long does it take to reach the Far East from Europe? Whether it is the Royal Navy or the US Navy, they can transport Soviet troops nearby." Alan Wilson said without thinking. "The Americans have said that they will consider it carefully." Edward Bridges broke Alan Wilson's fantasy. "It seems that this matter should be almost done. I believe that in the exchange between the leaders of the three countries, Truman also promised Stalin something. The new world hegemon is still a little immature. Maybe he has just stepped onto the world stage from America and is not used to the new role. Who made Truman, the US president, just come out of the novice village, and there is no experienced Secretary of State around him. This is his own choice." Edward Bridges had already determined where the problem was, but since it was an American problem, he couldn't say anything. Otherwise it would be interfering in the internal affairs of the Americans. "In general, you have completed your task, and the conditions you agreed to are all within the permitted range. Meet with the Soviets again tomorrow. Let's settle things." Now the whole world is waiting for this meeting to come up with the first consensus. Edward Bridges stopped talking nonsense and praised Alan Wilson. "Whether it is formal negotiations or secret operations, the agreement between the two sides is the basis for reaching a consensus." The cabinet secretary's meaning, according to Alan Wilson's understanding, translated into that the revolution has not yet succeeded. Comrades still need to work hard. I just don't know if the Soviets will give the desired results tomorrow. In the formal negotiations, the British delegation fully practiced the special relationship between Britain and the United States, exerted pressure from the perspective of the Americans, and expressed the common hatred of Britain and the United States on the issue of fighting against Japan. At the meeting, Ford strongly refuted the Soviet Union's claim that it had a neutrality treaty with Japan. In the past, Germany also signed a neutrality treaty with the Soviet Union, which did not prevent Germany from attacking the Soviet Union in the end. Britain and the United States hope that the Soviet Union can realize its original mistakes and not pin its hopes on Japan. This statement shocked everyone and won the approval of the Americans. It seemed that the glorious era of the British Empire had returned. Effort, except for being tough on the French, is not tough on any country. That was just a show for the Americans. What can we do? Britain still owes the Americans money. When meeting with Furtsever the next day, Alan Wilson said that everything was a misunderstanding. It was for the sake of making money, not shameful. After expressing his apologies, Alan Wilson changed the subject and said, "The Americans have already relented and are willing to mortgage Germany's commercial transport ships to the Soviet Union." Yesterday, Eiffel also proposed that he was willing to coordinate, and the British Empire's naval forces in the Far East would help the Soviet Union complete the landing plan. Of course, it all depends on our two countries. You Soviets may not be reassured, but I believe that the Soviet Union is not without any naval forces in the Far East. The Japanese Navy now only exists on paper, and it is unknown whether it can go to sea. To put it bluntly, Alan Wilson has been thinking about the remaining warships of the Japanese combined fleet to see if he can occupy a larger share when the compensation is paid. Even if the British Royal Navy does not need it, it can be sold exclusively. The British Empire has to learn to live frugally today. It is hard to imagine that the British Empire has such flexibility in its perspective on issues. Seever's words were full of sarcasm, referring to the two faces shown by the British in formal negotiations and behind-the-scenes operations. This is exactly how the British Empire has survived for 300 years. This is not a bad thing. All eggs should not be put in one basket. Alan Wilson completely regarded Seever's words as a compliment. As long as the goal is achieved, he is fully prepared to listen to some unpleasant words. The British side is willing to deploy forces in the Far East to cooperate with the Soviet Union's landing. I wonder if it will be in time. Seever asked the last question, hoping that Alan Wilson would give a guarantee. This is not a problem. Britain's forces in Asia are under the jurisdiction of General Mountbatten. I happen to be the liaison officer for British India. Alan Wilson said that everything is on his own, and this matter is not a problem. If it were someone else, he would not dare to make this guarantee, but if this person is Mountbatten, Mountbatten's biggest wish is to kill Tokyo and let Japan end up like Germany. In the secret operation, Alan Wilson said that Britain promised to let the Polish government in exile in London get out, and how to deal with it is the Soviet Union's business. In the formal negotiations, after bargaining, the British and American delegations expressed their willingness to hand over German commercial transport ships to the Soviet Union as part of the compensation. There was a glimmer of hope for the war against Japan. In the end, Stalin said during the summit meeting with Truman and Churchill that, as long as the conditions agreed by Britain and the United States were met, the Soviet Union could attack Japan and end the war. On the evening of June 30th, the first consensus on the Potsdam Conference was officially released, but the details were slightly different. Compared with the clear attitude of Britain and the United States, the Soviet Union's statement was actually very skillful. It not only recognized the war against Japan, but also did not say it in a final word. Compared with the reports of Britain and the United States, the Soviet Union deliberately deleted the clause of unconditional surrender in its statement. But on the surface, this was also a huge role played by the British and American delegations, especially the British delegation, and it was certainly worth celebrating. Eiffel had become the star of the British delegation, and he was very proud of himself. When he saw Alan Wilson, he greeted him happily. "Alan, what have you been doing these 2 days? You don't know my wonderful performance in the negotiations. I heard that the glorious era is back." Alan Wilson was amazed. Chapter 94, The First Consensus. As for what Alan Wilson did, if I think about it carefully, he did a lot. In addition to the problems of fighting against Japan and the Soviet Union's secret operations, it seems that he also mentioned the complementarity of the Soviet Union and Britain at this stage. Specific topics include, but are not limited to, if Britain, including France, is weakened too much, Western Europe will inevitably follow the lead of the United States in the future. If Britain is threatened by Soviet armed forces in the interest area that overlaps with the Soviet Union, it will inevitably attract the assistance of the United States. Not only will the Soviet Union fail to achieve its goals, but it will also replace Britain's power with the United States. This is mainly about Iran. At present, there are British troops stationed in the south of Iran and Soviet troops stationed in the north. This is also a historical tradition. As early as the period of confrontation between the British Empire and the Russian Empire, the sphere of influence in Iran had been demarcated. Economic topics were also discussed. Although the Soviet Union is vast and rich in resources, it is ultimately a high-latitude country. Many economic crops and resources are either not available or the development cost is very high. This is not a problem that can be solved by sending people to Siberia to grow potatoes. For example, rubber and other tropical crops. The Soviet Union cannot carry forward the spirit of hard work to bridge the gap. Britain has tropical colonies. As long as the Soviet Union is willing to pay in trade, Britain is willing to provide this raw material. This is good for both countries and can quickly recover from the war. As for other things like coffee and mango, even the United States has no reason to interfere with Britain and export tropical fruits for trade. There seems to be an idea of post-war recovery because Germany surrendered in May. It was past the sowing season, and the Soviet Union had been attacking and had no time to restore agriculture. As long as the Soviet Union was willing to take out a certain amount of foreign exchange to buy, the British Empire could raise a certain amount of food to help Eastern Europe survive the famine. Alan Wilson had already decided on the place of sacrifice. He would sacrifice British India. Maybe Nehru would be more honest when the famine occurred. As for the trivial matter that Hokkaido only had 2 divisions, he had forgotten whether he had said it without careful recollection. This was a good opportunity after all, because what he said would definitely be conveyed to Stalin's ears, and no one in the Soviet Union dared to hide anything from Stalin at this time. As a former world hegemon, the British Empire now seeks stability. Stability is above all else. The fewer things the better. Only in this way can there be time to adjust policies and finally land safely. If the Soviet Union does not make trouble, it is already helping Britain. The only thing is that the Soviet Union is not at peace. However, Alan Wilson had no way to share these words with F4, who had just made a big splash. He could only smile and sincerely wish him a sense of existence at such an important international conference. After clinking glasses, F4 said a few words with great interest and asked, "In fact, you should also join the ranks of formal negotiators. Otherwise you will not have no sense of existence. We just need to obey the instructions and follow the arrangements." Alan Wilson shook his head modestly. He still has things to do tomorrow. He needs to contact the Governor General's Office of India and send a fleet to the Far East. The British fleet in Asia is enough. At present, the British Royal Navy, if you count the escort aircraft carriers, has a total of 95 aircraft carriers. After the Normandy landing, the sea control of the Atlantic line has been regained, and part of the force was sent to Asia. In fact, in the eyes of the military blind, there were hundreds of aircraft carriers in the United States during World War II, and nearly 100 of them were also escort aircraft carriers. It was not a large-scale operation like the Normandy landing, and preparations were still needed. At present, the Royal Navy of the United Kingdom and Asia was fully sufficient, and with the Soviet Union's own preparations, it would be easy to transport hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. As for whether it would be in time, it was difficult to predict, but Alan Wilson was not pessimistic, because the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in Southeast Asia was Mountbatten, and Mountbatten was the speedholder of British warships. At the beginning of World War II, Mountbatten served as the captain of the destroyer Kelly of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet. The first time he boarded the ship, Mountbatten personally drove the Kelly out to sea and drove the battleship to 38.5 knots, which shocked everyone. With such a commander-in-chief of the speedholder of the British Royal Navy, I believe that the British fleet in Southeast Asia will be infected. In fact, he will prepare to send a telegram later, because time is tight and the task is heavy. This is a critical moment to test a civil servant. On the first day of July, the first consensus of the United Kingdom, the United States and the Soviet Union at the Potsdam Conference was determined, which was the issue of fighting against Japan. Although the only flaw was that the Soviet Union deleted the clause of unconditional surrender from its own copy, it did not undermine the good start of the Potsdam Conference. Soon, reports of fighting against Japan and urging Japan to surrender appeared on the pages of major newspapers. The members of the US delegation were very happy. From the faces of these negotiators, Alan Wilson estimated that the current President Truman was also happy. Since it has been published, it can almost be regarded as a fact. It is just unknown whether Truman will regret his eager request for the Soviet Union to fight against Japan after the successful explosion of the nuclear bomb. Considering that Truman, as the president of a world power, wanted to blatantly go back on his words and tear up the consensus with the Soviet Union under the witness of the British Empire. It is estimated that he would have to make some political determination. The consensus on fighting against Japan spread all over the world in a short time, and also reached the ears of the Japanese government. Fumimaro Kono, who served as Prime Minister of Japan 3 times, expressed his personal opinion to the Japanese emperor. Defeat is an inevitable result. The obstacle to ending the war comes from the military. The goal of Britain, the United States and China is to defeat the Japanese military. If the military falls, the nature of the war will also change. Shigenori Togo, who was once the ambassador to the Soviet Union, told the emperor in person that the Potsdam Declaration was just a copy of the Cairo Declaration. Although it should be accepted, it should be ignored, in order to wait for the result of the Soviet Union's mediation. There is no annotation of unconditional surrender in the Soviet Union's announcement, which shows that the Soviet Union still has doubts about attacking the Japanese mainland. If the Soviet Union can mediate and surrender conditionally, this goal is the direction that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs should strive for now. Even giving up part of the Kuril Islands is acceptable. At the Governor General's Office of India, Sir Beran held the telegram that had just been delivered. In addition to Ellen Wilson's longing for British India, the rest was the attitude towards the consensus reached at the Potsdam Conference on fighting against Japan. The telegram stated that Britain could avoid the losses caused by attacking the Japanese mainland and let the Soviet Union bear the losses, which was a victory in itself. The Royal Navy fleet in Asia should rush to the Far East immediately to help the Soviet army attack and land. Not even a day should be wasted to create a fait accompli. It would be too late for the Soviet Union to regret it. At the same time that British India received the telegram from Europe, Marshal Vasilevsky, who had already arrived in the Far East, also received a telegram from Moscow. This is how history books are. It takes longer to look up information than to type. Chapter 95 Our People. Marshal Vasilevsky has been in the Far East for a year. In fact, the Soviet Union was not completely unprepared for the war against Japan. As early as after the end of the Belarusian campaign, the Supreme Command entrusted Vasilevsky to make preliminary calculations for the Soviet army, to assemble along the Heilongjiang River, in the coastal area, and in the Trans-Baikal region, and to determine the materials necessary for the war against Japanese imperialism. Before the Battle of Berlin, the Far East combat plan had been agreed by Moscow. After Germany formally surrendered, Vasilevsky was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Army in the Far East, responsible for commanding the Trans-Baikal Front, the First Far East Front, the Second Far East Front and the Pacific Fleet. However, compared with the Soviet Union's ease on land, the maritime force it relied on was only a drop in the bucket. Although Moscow suddenly increased its support for the Far East before and after the Battle of Berlin, the Soviet Union could only organize forces to support a landing force of 50,000 to 60,000 people. Of course, the telegram that arrived in the hands of Marshal Vasilevsky at the same time also showed the headquarters' determination to do everything possible. It also stated that the British fleet in Southeast Asia had arrived overnight and would provide support for the landing operation. For this reason, Marshal Vasilevsky changed the landing plan in the Kuril Islands and set his sights on Hokkaido, the second largest island in Japan. In the Far East Command, Marshal Vasilevsky said to his subordinates, if the intelligence is true, the number of Japanese troops in Hokkaido is really not much more than the garrison in the Kuril Islands. In the battle on the Pacific Front, the US military adopted a combat method called island hopping tactics. For our already stretched maritime forces, it is more important to set clear offensive targets and not waste military power on worthless targets. The island hopping tactic is a tactic adopted by the US military when counterattacking Japan. Instead of conquering each island one by one or in sequence, it attacks one by one, thus achieving the actual occupation of the attacked island and forcing other islands to surrender without a fight. So the Battle of Okinawa broke out, but Scam Island was still under Japanese rule, because Scam Island was the stronghold that the US military skipped with the island hopping tactic, and the occupation of Okinawa cut off the connection between the Japanese mainland and Scam Island. Marshal Vasilevsky learned of Moscow's eagerness and gave up the landing in the Kuril Islands. preparing to copy the US military's island hopping tactics and attack Hokkaido. Although the objective conditions are insufficient, comrades do not need to be too anxious. We also have favorable conditions. For example, the telegram from Moscow also explained Japan's remarks seeking peace. According to the analysis of diplomatic comrades, Japan's attitude towards our Soviet Union is to avoid war and seek peace, while its attitude towards the United States should be to seek peace through war. Under the current conditions, the core of the Far East campaign must think of ways on the Korean peninsula to supplement the lack of preparation on the Hokkaido front. The distance between the Korean peninsula and the Japanese mainland is not far. Comrades, please remember a term, that Tsushima Strait. As soon as Marshal Vasilevsky finished speaking, the Far East Command fell into silence. That Tsushima Strait is the waters between Tsushima Island and Iki Island at the western edge of the North Pacific Ocean and the southwestern end of the Japanese archipelago. That Tsushima Strait extends from northeast to southwest, is about 200 kilometers long, 40 kilometers at the narrowest point, and has a water depth of 50 to 100 meters. The continental shelf is very developed, and the bottom of the strait is relatively flat. That was the place where the Imperial Japanese Navy defeated the Imperial Russian Navy in the Battle of Tsushima. However, for Marshal Vasilevsky, the naval battle decades ago was not the purpose of his talk. What he wanted to say next was what he wanted to say. Comrade Malinovsky, your mission is to attack Japanese-occupied Korea and rush all the way to the Tsushima Strait, which is the closest to the Korean peninsula and the Japanese mainland. Don't worry about other things. Annihilate the Japanese troops on the peninsula, and at the same time, collect ships that can cross the sea on the peninsula. Decide whether to proceed with the next step of the operation, based on the progress of the occupation. Understood, Comrade Vasilevsky. Malinovsky was born in Ossad, and is now the commander of the Trans-Baikal Front. He arrived in the Far East after the end of the European War, 1 year later than Marshal Vasilevsky. After revising the operational plan, Marshal Vasilevsky placed the main attack target of the Trans-Baikal Front led by Marshal Malinovsky on the Korean peninsula. Cover the Soviet Union's attack on Hokkaido. Not to mention the impact of the Far East Command's revision of the operational plan. The Potsdam Conference is still going on. Even Alan Wilson was still engaged in secret operations. He thought that his work would be over once the war against Japan was settled. Facts prove that he, a civil servant in British India, was still naive about the issue of secret operations. Once such a thing started, it would inevitably happen countless times. Cabinet Secretary Edward Bridges shattered Alan Wilson's naivety with just 2 sentences. As long as the formal talks at the Potsdam Conference were not over, there was no reason to end the private bargaining with the Soviet Union. Seeing Alan Wilson's surprised look, Edward Bridges explained calmly, "This is what happened during the Munich conference. The negotiating parties have changed, but the British Empire is still the party involved. But I have nothing to say. Hasn't the issue of war against Japan been discussed?" Alan Wilson said with a wry smile, "You can't eat and drink wine with a Soviet woman every day. Isn't this a waste of national resources?" "Yeah." Edward Bridges acknowledged Alan Wilson's understanding of the waste of national resources and gave encouragement, but answered the question without changing his original intention. "But we generally call this diplomacy. Isn't this too sophisticated?" Alan Wilson didn't know whether to laugh or cry, and said with a bitter face, "Sir Edward, I shouldn't have too much contact with the Soviets. I still want to make progress. I want to make progress too much. If the secret operation I conducted with the Soviets at the Potsdam Conference is known in the future, it may cause trouble for my future. All your actions are for the benefit of the British Empire, and all your words and deeds will be archived." Edward Bridges said calmly, "There is no possibility of leakage, and no one can verify it. But the election is coming soon. What if the next government knows about it?" Alan Wilson also knew that such things should not be said casually, and deliberately lowered his voice. "The opposition party came to power. Do you think our respected Prime Minister and Foreign Minister will take the initiative to talk to the leader of the opposition party? Have you betrayed the interests of your loyal allies? Don't worry, you are ours." Edward Bridges raised his eyebrows, raised his wrist to check the time and said, "I said you were dealing with the British occupied areas these days. Let's go." If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 96. Good job. To be honest, Alan Wilson really had nothing to say. The Soviet side knew everything he could and couldn't say. In this case, he had to take care of the interests of the British Empire. He was not a Soviet cadre. But Edward Bridges obviously didn't know that Alan Wilson was a keyboard warrior deep in his heart. He was not good at wasting time doing nothing. He still asked a civil servant who wanted to make progress too much to argue with the Soviets. Just when the topic had shifted from post-war reconstruction to the fashion trends of Soviet women, Fert Seaver, who was also not a professional diplomat, took the initiative to help Alan Wilson find something to do. Should we talk about it, or take a look at the German fleet that is about to be handed over to the Soviet Union? Of course there is no problem, but I need to ask for instructions from above. Alan Wilson stretched out his index finger and pointed upwards. This was a good thing for him. If he continued, the topic of discussion would be expanded to postpartum care for SOs. In the evening, Alan Wilson reported to Edward Bridges, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, about the Soviet Union's request to inspect the German fleet. Edward Bridges sighed and said, "The Soviets are really direct and don't want to wait for a moment." The United States and the Soviet Union were very anxious in this negotiation. The United States eagerly asked the Soviet Union to send troops, giving the Soviet Union the opportunity to ask for a big price. Alan Wilson's tone was not friendly. In his imagination, the remaining 800,000 tons of merchant ships in Germany should be used to contribute to the trade in the British occupation zone and British India. If these merchant ships were in the hands of the Soviets, they would not be used in the war against Japan at all, because Japan was about to surrender. The transfer of the fleet was not good for the British Empire, but the Americans agreed, so he naturally couldn't stop it. Looking at the division of occupation zones, you can see that Germany's best coastline and industrial areas are in the British occupation zone, and the American occupation zone is an inland occupation zone, so the transfer of the German fleet will have to be borne by the British Empire. This is why Alan Wilson would rather let General Mountbatten, the speedkeeper of the British Empire's warships, send the Asian fleet to help the Soviet Union than agree to the Soviet Union's request for the German fleet. The American occupied zone had no share of the German fleet, so the Americans were of course generous. However, Alan Wilson did not give the Americans any advantage. If the Soviet Union really took out its determination to occupy Hokkaido at all costs, it would not be a loss if the value of Hokkaido was compared with the value of the German fleet. Alan is still very young and doesn't know that diplomacy requires trade-offs. Edward Bridges calmly tried to smooth things over with Prime Minister Churchill and Foreign Secretary Robert Eden. He said that Alan Wilson's mistake was unintentional, and then changed the subject. "Since the Soviets are so anxious, you should accompany the Soviet representatives and put the meeting on hold for the time being. The British occupied zone is ours anyway, and everything will be much more convenient there." The Potsdam conference this time was held in the Soviet occupied zone. The cabinet secretary meant that once they arrived in the British occupied zone, the initiative would return to the hands of Britain. At the same time, he said that he still had things to discuss with the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary, so he stood up and turned to Churchill and said, "Prime Minister, I'll see Alan off." After leaving the room, Edward Bridges' voice changed, and his eyes behind the lenses became indifferent. "Alan, although you didn't say it explicitly, your tone just now, and your comments on the United States and the Soviet Union are not desirable." "Sir Edward, what's wrong?" Alan Wilson frowned and thought about it, but didn't find anything wrong. Regarding the operation of the war against Japan, there is nothing wrong with being dissatisfied with the United States and the Soviet Union, but the current situation is that the only remaining fleet of Germany is indeed in our hands, and the Americans have indeed generously given the Soviets what we in Britain have in our hands. Edward Bridges said slowly, "If the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary think deeply about this result, they will think that you are secretly dissatisfied with the respected Prime Minister and the outstanding Foreign Secretary." "No way." Alan Wilson's mouth twitched. Can he even associate this? Is his imagination too rich? So why do you think that all public documents at the government level are written in such neutral, boring words that you can't read them after just one look? Edward Bridges smiled slightly and nodded to himself. That's why, in a colony like British India, you don't have to care about such wording. Good as good, bad as bad. The British Empire is the ruler. It has to implement the policies of the empire and use any means, but it's different in the mainland. I understand, sir. Alan Wilson corrected his mistakes as soon as he knew them. Even if he thought Edward Bridges was making a fuss in his heart, he could feel that the head of the civil servants had good intentions. Since the Soviets want to hurry, you will accompany them to the port. Edward Bridges nodded with satisfaction, expressing his approval of Alan Wilson's attitude of correcting his mistakes. It's not a bad thing to leave Berlin for a few days. Edward Bridges had his own considerations in the future. Since it was a secret operation of matter, there was no reason to change the generals at the last minute. The Soviet delegation to the British zone was led by Furt Seaver, who shared the same fate as Alan Wilson. In the formal meeting, the three delegations publicly recognized this matter, which showed the transparency of the entire Potsdam Conference. Furt Seaver, who was preparing to set off from Berlin to the British zone, might have been the first time to go deep into the place controlled by imperialism. She was a little nervous. What is our schedule? Will Marshal Montgomery meet us? Marshal Montgomery is a little busy recently. Alan Wilson puffed his cheeks, but he was telling the truth. Marshal Montgomery was on a European tour. This man who had imprisoned himself in the tactical command during the war seemed to suddenly get unlimited pleasure from the cheers of the people. He maintained correspondence with many units and individuals, football clubs, charitable organizations, and everyone who was willing to write to him. He was always happy to attend various ceremonies held in various countries, whether it was accepting the title of honorary citizen of an autonomous city, giving a speech at a grand rally, or becoming an honorary doctor at Oxford University or Cambridge University. He always accepted everyone and participated in everything. A quick look at his schedule will show this. Perhaps in the eyes of other diplomats, accompanying Furt Seaver to the British occupation zone was a good job. Who knows what might happen in the British occupation zone with a beautiful Soviet lady, especially the Americans, who would definitely think so. Chapter 97 General Election. Alan Wilson did not expect anything to happen with Furt Seaver. After all, she was a member of the Soviet delegation. Breaking through national taboos to have some in-depth exchanges might cost him a bright future, which was not a wise choice for Alan Wilson, who was devoted to pursuing progress. Moreover, the other party was not easy to fool. Now the German occupation zones were all in ruins. The British, French and American occupation zones in the West had suffered heavy bombing and looked even more miserable than the agricultural areas in Eastern Germany. He wanted to let the Soviets see the prosperity of capitalism, but there was no such condition at present. On the military plane heading to the British occupation zone, the atmosphere between the British representatives and the representatives sent by the Soviet Union was a little awkward. Finally, Alan Wilson had to say a few words to Furt Seaver. At least on the surface, they were all allies. This was the case before Japan surrendered, which was not conducive to the unity among the allies. The first impression of the Soviet representatives who arrived at the British occupied zone was the German soldiers in the British occupied zone. Furt Seaver said to satisfiedly, "Have you rearmed the German soldiers? It's not about arming. We just released the prisoners of war to form auxiliary forces to maintain the stability of the British occupied zone." Alan Wilson admitted Furt Seaver's accusation and dragged the United States into the water. Ordinary prisoners of war obey orders to fight, and they cannot be liquidated. If the Soviets have some understanding of the American occupied zone, they will know that a large number of German officers in Bavaria have been restored to freedom. It is even more excessive there. You can send someone to take a look. The British Empire's hostility towards the Soviet Union is just for fun. If they are really anti-Soviet, they have to say that it is the Americans. Sure enough, with Alan Wilson's comparison of bad tactics, the Soviets' hostility immediately shifted to the Americans. Regarding the liquidation of German criminal organizations, Alan Wilson raised his hand in favor. The American occupied zone is the base camp of former German senior officials, and Himmler's beautiful daughter is also there. Let the Soviets bite the United States, and the British Empire can adopt a friendly and neutral attitude. The British Empire fully complies with the Geneva Convention. As for whether you Soviets and Americans will comply, and how much you comply, the national conditions of each country are different, and we cannot interfere. Alan Wilson sarcastically said to Furtsever. Do you mean that we, the Soviet Union, deliberately abused German prisoners of war and let them disappear naturally? Furtsever asked back dissatisfiedly, you imperialist countries are innocent? What a joke. To be precise, my words only refer to Britain, not the United States. It is your freedom to make people disappear, but if we do it, we must come up with a resolution after democratic discussion, and make the final decision. Alan Wilson raised his eyebrows. This is already the British occupation zone, and he doesn't have to live under someone else's roof, like he did in Berlin. The lives of prisoners of war in the British occupation zone are guaranteed, which is not a bad thing. Only by preserving enough labor can the British occupation zone have the foundation for taking off first, which can allow Britain to have a greater voice in the future merger. From a basic point of view, the British occupation zone is still very advantageous. It is an important industrial area in Germany, the most densely populated area, and the area with the most ports. As long as it recovers first in other occupied areas and forms a siphon effect, Britain will benefit greatly. The siphon effect exists everywhere, even in South Asia. India has long been the richest country in South Asia. Although India is poor in the eyes of other places, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal around India are all poorer than India. Once the siphon effect takes the lead, it is difficult for latecomers to catch up. Not to mention that the British occupied zone itself is the most populous part of Germany. Once it gets rid of the depression first, it will have an impact on the American occupied zone and the French occupied zone. At that time, Britain will be more confident when negotiating with the United States on the German issue. It is still a little early to think about these things now. Alan Wilson took Furtsever and other Soviet representatives to the British Army headquarters to apply for identity certificates. Because Montgomery was enjoying welcome and applause from European countries before the celebration was over, he was only a nominal head of the British occupied zone. The specific work of the British Army headquarters was in charge of Lieutenant General Ronald Weeks. The last time Alan Wilson came to Hamburg, he met with Vice Admiral Ronald Weeks, who still had an impression of him. After learning the purpose of his visit, he asked, "Are they the Soviets? Are they here to take over the German merchant fleet?" "I'm afraid that's the case." Alan Wilson shrugged helplessly and said, "I just came here to assist the Soviets in taking over. The United States put pressure on us and used the German fleet in exchange for the Soviet Union's concessions on some issues. The Americans don't do good things." Ronald Weeks' face was not very happy when he heard it. Everyone was wary of the Soviets, but it didn't mean that the United States, Britain and France were all in harmony. There were all the dirty things that should be there, but they were not so obvious. There is no way. The Soviet Union is an obvious enemy, and the United States is a suspicious ally. They are all thinking about our huge British assets. Alan Wilson said bad things about the United States, and stopped while he was ahead. For the future of the British Empire, he had to pretend to be happy and hand over the German fleet to the Soviets. Now Alan Wilson is no longer as resistant as he was in Potsdam. In fact, the German fleet can only serve as icing on the cake if it stays. It is also beneficial to give it to the Soviets. The shipbuilding industry in Britain is developed. Germany has lost these merchant ships, but the demand of Germany as a whole is still there. Maybe it is also a good thing for the British shipbuilding industry, and it may also make Britain's control over the British occupied areas deeper. Now the 18 million tons of fleets left in Britain can still transport colonial products from all over the world to Europe, even if there is no German fleet to supplement them, and it will not delay the reconstruction of Europe. Compared with Europe, for the citizens of Britain, the first general election after the war is more important. The glory of the British Empire is important, but the series of consequences brought about by the war cannot be diluted by the glory of the British Empire alone. While Alan Wilson led the Soviets to point fingers at the German fleet, Prime Minister Churchill was at the Potsdam Conference, but he was powerless. The first general election in Britain after the war officially kicked off On one side was the ruling Conservative Party, which led the British Empire to victory in World War II, and on the other side was the Labour Party led by Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee challenged Churchill, who was at the Potsdam Conference, in his proposal to restore the happiness of British citizens and nationalize important industries. On July 5, the first general election after the war began. Chapter 98. Former Prime Minister Churchill. If nothing unexpected happens, the Labour Party will give a surprise to Churchill, who was in charge of the country at the Potsdam Conference. Alan Wilson has no doubt about this, and this does not mean that, if the Labour Party comes to power, the British Empire will be sold out without leaving any underwear. The relationship between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party is very similar to the relationship between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the United States. One is more implicit and the other is more direct, but they do the same thing. Especially on the issue of colonies, Attlee and Churchill only differ in details. The changes in the attitudes of the two parties towards the extensive colonies of the British Empire are actually the same, firmly maintaining, focusing on support, limited persistence, partial abandonment, and comprehensive withdrawal. In fact, except for British India, Attlee did not give up any colonies when he was in power. The situation in British India was really forced to give up, because it was beyond the national strength of Britain. Moreover, the Great Disarmament in Britain in the 1950s actually occurred after the Conservative Party regained power. On the streets of London, Labour Party supporters shouted the Labour Party's propositions in support of Attlee, a high and rising standard of living, lifting all people out of poverty, and establishing an education system that enables every boy and girl to develop their talents. A vote for the Labour Party is the beginning of the decline of the British Empire. Only Churchill can make Britain great again. If Alan Wilson heard this in China, as a diehard fan of King of Understanding, he would definitely give the other party a fist. Blatant plagiarism. Where is the gentleman's face? Unfortunately, he was not in China, but accompanied Furtsever to count the German fleet, left in major ports in Germany. He had adjusted his mentality, and did his best to complete his task. I thought you would definitely be reluctant. After all, the German fleet is in the hands of you British. Furtsever was in a good mood, but her cough from time to time was a bit of a letdown. A lean camel is bigger than a horse. This fleet is not even in the eyes of the British Empire. Alan Wilson puffed up his face and said stubbornly, as a continental country, the Soviet Union does not know what a century-old navy is. Without 20 years, the Soviet Union cannot compete with Britain at sea. Really? I can't see that. Furtsever covered her mouth and chuckled teasingly. Then why listen to the Americans and give us the German fleet in your hands? The Americans will pay the price for this. Alan Wilson thought to himself, looked at Furtsever deeply and left. Although the Braxton Woods system is a good helper to consolidate hegemony, it also has certain limitations. Under this system, although the United States is the leader of capitalist countries, Britain and France also have the ability to prevent the United States from going too far. He remembered that in the 10 years from the 1960s to the 1970s, Britain, France, and Germany took advantage of the United States being mired in the Vietnam War and launched continuous financial attacks on the United States. The United States really has the final say in the West, or after the dollar and oil are tied together, it has kidnapped the whole of Europe at the same time. This is the British occupied zone. Alan Wilson, who had walked 2 steps, suddenly turned back and muttered, "What are you Soviets so proud of?" Although the German commercial fleet has grown from 5 million tons before the war to 800,000 tons today, it is still a huge gain for the Soviet Union, a purely continental country, because the Soviet Union's sea transportation is indeed stretched. It is only slightly stronger than the 3 defeated Germany, Italy, and Japan, less than a fraction of Britain and the United States, and even worse than France, which threw away its rifles. From Furtsever's cautious actions, Alan Wilson could also judge that the Soviet Union should attach great importance to this batch of German fleets to be transferred. While the transfer was taking place here, Britain, the United States and the Soviet Union were still engaged in a series of confrontations at the Potsdam Conference regarding the border issue between Germany and Poland, as well as the part of East Prussia and the former Free Zone of Danzig that was not under the jurisdiction of the Soviet Union. They were all under the jurisdiction of the Polish government. Britain and the United States agreed to establish diplomatic relations with the Provisional Government of National Unification of Poland. Britain and the United States also agreed to cede Königsberg and the surrounding areas to the Soviet Union as a punishment for Germany's initiation of the war. In this way, through the Potsdam Conference, Germany's borders were officially changed to what people in later generations are familiar with. Poland lost its original Western Belarus and Western Ukraine, which were incorporated into the Soviet territory. Regarding the issue of German compensation, it was determined that the compensation demands made by the Soviet Union will be met by confiscating the assets of the Soviet-occupied areas in Germany and the corresponding German foreign investments. In addition, the Soviet Union can also get 10% of the industrial facilities demolished in the Western occupation zone free of charge and 15% paid in goods as compensation. In other words, the British occupied areas could not escape the treatment of being bled by the Soviet Union. The British delegation stated that, although it agreed to the Soviet Union's suggestions for Poland, the Polish government in exile must return to Poland and participate in Poland's post-war reconstruction on a democratic basis. This was a proposition that Alan Wilson and Fert Seever had already made in the secret operation. Britain used reasonable and legal excuses to let the Polish government in exile and its supporters return to Poland. As for how the Soviet Union was willing to deal with it, and what methods it would use, that was the Soviets' own business. Stalin had even thought of a solution, and was ready to send Marshal Rokossovski to Poland, to wait for the return of the Polish government in exile. Marshal Rokossovski was Polish. During the process of handing over the fleet, Alan Wilson suddenly said, in fact, the Soviet Union can use the Yugoslav issue to put pressure on the Americans and see if it can exchange the four-nation occupation of Berlin. Since the Yugoslav refugee incident, in order to prevent similar incidents from happening again, the Soviet Red Army has blocked the Austrian border and spoke for Yugoslavia at the Potsdam Conference, which embarrassed Truman. This move is very reasonable. More than 200,000 people in Yugoslavia did run to the US occupied zone. The Soviet Union occupied the region and turned the four-nation occupation, which was originally in name only, into the Soviet occupation of Austria. The Potsdam Conference fell into a deadlock on the Austrian issue. Stalin said that the current status quo in Austria should not be changed for the time being, which made Prime Minister Churchill very dissatisfied. What made Churchill even more uncomfortable was that he seemed to become a former prime minister. With the remaining prestige of defeating Germany, Churchill, who was at the Potsdam Conference, fell behind the Labour Party in the elections that had already been counted. If this trend continues, the Conservative Party will lose the general election, and the situation in some areas where the votes were delayed is not optimistic. 2 days later, the results of the election came out, and Churchill gloriously became the former Prime Minister of the British Empire. Which side are you civil servants on? Fert Seever heard the British people discussing the election results, and asked Alan Wilson in a provocative tone after meeting him. The winning side. Alan Wilson straightened his back, and replied with a quote from Stalin, "The victor is not to be blamed." Chapter 99 Welcoming the new Prime Minister. You are already a mature bureaucrat, and you are really very flexible. Fert Seever chuckled and then coughed a few times. Don't you forget to mock the imperialism you are talking about when you are not feeling well. Bureaucratic problems exist all over the world. Don't think that any country is an exception. Alan Wilson glanced at the other party. He had to take medicine when he was not feeling well. It seems that with the current progress, we can list the list in 3 or 4 days. I believe that the people you receive are already on the way. As for when the Soviet Union will fight against Japan, Alan Wilson has no way of knowing. Now it is believed that the British delegation at the Potsdam Conference is also ready to welcome the arrival of the new Prime Minister. At least now Alan Wilson does not have to worry about being held accountable for his gaffes a few days ago in the short term, and even if he cares about it, he will have enough time to make up for it in the future. In history, after Queen Elizabeth ascended the throne, in order to commend Churchill's achievements, she was prepared to confer Churchill the title of Duke of London, but Churchill refused. It is rumored that Churchill gave up the dukedom for his son, which is completely nonsense. Churchill's son is really unlucky and has to take the blame. If Churchill's son wants to go into politics, he can give up the title himself. The real reason is that Churchill accepted the Duke of London for his own sake. It would only affect Churchill himself. If he accepted the title of Duke of London, he would no longer be a member of the House of Commons, and could only be a member of the House of Lords. In this case, he would not be able to speak in the House of Commons, because he was not a member of the House of Commons. Even if a famous person farts, people will interpret it from different angles. The current election has already shown how British citizens view Churchill now, and the result speaks for itself. Anyway, Alan Wilson is ready to wait for the new Prime Minister to airborne the Potsdam Conference. I believe that the Cabinet Secretary and the Foreign Secretary are more prepared. Hamburg has not changed much since the last time he came. Germany's mental state has improved slightly, and there is no trend of approaching British India before, but it is still very poor. Thanks to the adjustment of the British military command, the order in the British occupied zone has been restored quickly. Originally, after completing the reception work, he was going to return to Berlin, wait for the end of the Potsdam Conference, and then return to the British occupied zone to continue working. The plan was good, but First fell ill. The World War had just ended, and there were no medicines in the German people, and the Soviets did not carry them. Alan Wilson had no choice but to see if the British troops had any solution. He was not interrogated. The British occupation forces even rescued German prisoners, not to mention a guest from an ally. He brought some fruits to visit First. Alan Wilson was still doing another job during this period, which was to make the Soviet Union maintain goodwill towards Britain and to vent his anger on the Americans. According to the internal censorship standards of the Soviet Union, First would definitely be interrogated after returning. Alan Wilson did not expect to instigate a future Soviet official, but just hoped that there would be opportunities for cooperation between the two countries in the future. Britain hated Soviet politics, but not the Soviet ruble. As long as it could help the British Empire to smoothly pass the difficult times, whether it was the US dollar or the ruble, it was a good thing. To be fair, some of our colleagues' doubts about the Soviet Union mainly focus on whether it will abide by the treaty. Judging from the Soviet Union's history, its record in this regard is not good. Alan Wilson said to the somewhat tired First while peeling an apple, the Soviet Union defaulted on its loans from the Allied powers just after its establishment. That's imperialist exploitation. First retorted weakly with half-closed eyes. If she had not been out of strength, she would have said a few more words. Is it the exploitation of imperialism that resulted in the Allied forces attacking the Soviet Union, which caused greater losses than the debt owed? Alan Wilson took the peeled apple, cut a few pieces, and handed them to First. Seeing that the latter did not take it, he frowned and said, "Dear lady, although I admit that you are very beautiful, if you were younger, I would even consider treason, but don't you think you should take it yourself? Do you want me to feed you? Does your husband agree?" Only then did First reach out and take the apple, and said unhappily, "How old are you, and you already have such an idea? I won't be surprised if you are targeted by a female spy in the future. I'm very guarded." Alan Wilson spoke fiercely. "Otherwise, in your weak state now, I can do whatever I want. Who can stop me? This is the British occupied area." Although there is already a trend, Alan Wilson is not ready to take action. This is a fatal black spot for both sides. Why do you feel uncomfortable when you are living well? Moreover, this is not in line with Alan Wilson's life creed, which is to be submissive to the imperialist powers and strike hard at the third world countries. Ms. First, I believe you don't want your country to face the United States, Britain and France at the same time. I have never denied the strength of the Soviet Union, which has been proven by this war. However, the Soviet Union has also suffered great losses. What we should consider now is to consolidate the existing achievements. Like Britain, we need time to recuperate. As for how the relationship between Britain and the Soviet Union will be in 10 years, that is a matter for the future. Alan Wilson implicitly reminded the Soviet Union not to be too greedy. Although there are a large number of Soviet supporters in Western Europe, the Soviet Union itself has also been hit hard and is afraid of both ends. Think about how you broke through the diplomatic dilemma after World War I. It was nothing more than complicating a simple problem. At the same time, you negotiated with the United States, Britain and France, and use the contradictions between the three countries to achieve a diplomatic breakthrough. Now it is different. If the Soviet Union itself has not recovered, it will continue to cause trouble to Britain and France, which have not recovered either. It will only make it easier for the United States to annex our interests. In his words, Alan Wilson meant that in 1945 and even in the next few years, Britain and the Soviet Union had no conflict of interest, and both countries needed time to recover after the war. If the Soviet Union caused trouble, it would only benefit the United States, which was not affected by the war. Until Third recovered, Alan Wilson kept repeating the historical fact that Lenin broke through the diplomatic dilemma after World War I. He knew that once Third returned, Stalin would definitely ask about it. It was very strange to write this chapter. I have a book where the protagonist gives apples, which means that this person is about to die. Chapter 100 Politicians and Civil Servants. The nuances of history are normal, just as Tito's opponents were purged in history, but are now alive and well. The current era is within the normal range. Before Alan Wilson returned to Potsdam, the British Prime Minister who represented the British Empire at the Potsdam Conference had been replaced. Churchill was replaced by the new Prime Minister Attlee, who was immediately appointed as an advisor, and obtained the right to continue to stay in the Potsdam Conference as an observer. Also coming with the new Prime Minister Attlee was the new Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, who was a trade union leader, and had organized and led the 1926 national strike. Like many parties supported by workers in this era, Ernest Bevin advocated that Britain should take the initiative to fight against the German and Italian threats when Hitler rose. For a long time, parties that were close to workers were all war parties according to the classification of later generations. For example, the Democratic Party of the United States before Kennedy was a purely white party. The Australian Labour Party first implemented the White Australia policy. During the First World War, the socialist parties in various European countries firmly supported the war. Parties that have close relations with workers are often the decisive force in joining the war, which is unimaginable in Europe, where white leftism is prevalent in later generations. After the new Prime Minister Attlee and the new Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin arrived in Potsdam, Truman was a little unhappy. On the contrary, Stalin was in a very good mood. Because both the new Prime Minister and the new Foreign Secretary are obviously pro-Soviet element in the eyes of many people. When Britain participated in intervening in the Soviet-Russian Revolution, Ernest Bevin encouraged London dock workers to take the lead, and declared that, if the military supplies shipped to Poland on the Silly George ship were not moved away, they would refuse to load the ship, which put great pressure on the government. The number 1 and number 2 figures of the new British government came to Potsdam with such obvious pro-Soviet element. It is conceivable what Truman felt. This is the situation at Cecilienhof Palace when Alan Wilson returned to Potsdam. First, he reported to the Foreign Office Secretary and the Cabinet Secretary, and asked Edward Bridges, "Sir Edward, is it my job to hide something from the Prime Minister?" Edward Bridges hesitated for a moment, shook his head slowly, and said, "No, this is not in the country. The international conference is still going on, and our private transactions with the Soviets cannot be concealed from the new Prime Minister. Because the meeting has not ended yet, and the secret operation will continue, at this time, we must be honest with the new Prime Minister. But the former Prime Minister is still here." Alan Wilson scratched his head, not knowing the consequences of doing so. Civil servants take a friendly and neutral attitude towards the alternation of political parties. Alexander Cadogan on the side interjected, "As for the handover between Mr. Churchill and the Prime Minister, that is their business." "Very good." Edward Bridges uttered a word, and the meaning was obvious. "Ah, Mr. Churchill." Alan Wilson understood what was going on. If he still didn't understand what it meant, he would be stupid. He then asked, "I wonder what the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary's attitude is towards this meeting." To be honest, it's much more moderate than Mr. Churchill's attitude towards the Soviet Union. Our foreign minister has a very good relationship with Molotov, and the hostility between us has been reduced a lot. Edward Bridges changed the subject and said, "In fact, there is no conflict between us and the Soviet Union. It's just that some politicians have inexplicable hostility towards the Soviet Union." "Yes, there is no conflict. Alexander Cadogan also hurriedly distanced himself from the relationship. We are just implementing Mr. Churchill's policies, which does not mean that we agree with their ideas. Is this them? Although Alan Wilson thought so in his heart, he also showed a look of moving closer to the organization. In fact, if the Prime Minister participated in the negotiations instead of Mr. Churchill, the talks might have been completed. It is very likely. Alexander Cadogan agreed, not caring about the embarrassment of me opposing myself. When Alan Wilson was about to report on the private transaction with the Soviet Union, Alexander Cadogan followed him out and stopped Alan Wilson. Permanent Undersecretary, what's the matter? Alan Wilson was puzzled. He recalled the process just now and found nothing wrong. Sir Edward, I don't agree with some of the Prime Minister's views. You have experience as a civil servant in British India. If the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary ask about the situation in British India, you have to tell us. Alexander Cadogan was afraid that Alan Wilson didn't understand, so he lowered his voice and said, the Soviet Union's affairs have nothing to do with us in the final analysis, but British India is related to the lives of 100,000 civil servants and their families. Do you understand? I understand. Alan Wilson's face was serious. It seemed that the Cabinet Secretary and the new Prime Minister had a disagreement on the issue of British India. As the Cabinet Secretary, Edward Bridges, in the eyes of the head of the civil service, the Soviet Union issue was far less important than the British India issue. The head of the civil service was concerned about scale and budget. The 100,000 civil servants in British India were an important part of the British Empire's civil service system, and the scale was close to half of the local civil servants. If the new Prime Minister was not prepared to continue to spend time in British India, what would happen to these civil servants? The problem was already known, but Alan Wilson had no idea of a solution. He could only pray that he was a small figure, and that the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary would not think of asking for the opinion of such an insignificant character. This is really the Conservative Party style, and it's a secret operation again. Ernest Bevin, who had just become Foreign Secretary, commented sarcastically after listening to Alan Wilson's report. I wonder why Molotov is so kind, and he focuses all his attention on this kind of thing. None of the real problems have been solved. What about Austria's ownership? The Soviet Union has blocked the border between Austria and Yugoslavia, and said that it is not suitable to change the status quo in a short period of time. What should we do? Dear Foreign Secretary, this is actually a problem between the United States and the Soviets. Alan Wilson maintained his original statement that the Yugoslavs fled to the American-occupied zone and had nothing to do with the British Empire. He had to speak at this time to prevent the two new big guys from having no topics to talk about and really remembering to ask about British India. Foreign Minister, the Soviets have officially informed us that they are declaring war on Japan. Just as they were treading on thin ice, Alexander Cadogan, Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, pushed open the door and walked in. The Soviet delegation just informed us that the Soviet Union has entered a state of war with Japan. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.